All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. We are on part 4. We're going to cover chapters 1 through 5. We've got several amazing panelists. We're going to start with Rob, then Maritza, then Sherri, then Rupali, then Joia, and Iris. After the presentations, everybody gets to comment and ask questions. We'll organize all the questions and we will have a Q&A. Let's get started. Rob, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Mine unmuted.
Yep,
okay, good.
I've got you.
All right. So first we're going to share a screen. So we talked a while back, I think before we were doing the Romantic Manifesto stuff, we talked about the scene of the boy and the bicycle that leads off part 1 or the first chapter of the Howard Roark section. And the Howard Roark section is really about, it's the affirmation section, right? Where finally Howard Roark, the main character, is finally, he's the title of the section of the book. So this is really affirmation of his success and his achievement. So it begins with that, with the boy and the bicycle discovering the Mid-Atlantic Valley development and being inspired by it. And there's something I wanted to, so I was not going to cover this, but then I was shamed into doing it because I really ought to do it, to do the two works of music. So there's the boy, the bicycle wants to be a composer. And here's the section. Here's the passage. He had always wanted to write music and he could give no other identity to the thing he sought. If you want to know what it is, he told himself, listen to the first phrases of Tchaikovsky's first concerto or the last movement of Rachmaninoff's second. Men have not found the words for it, nor the deed, nor the thought, but they have found the music. Let me see that in one single act of man on earth. Let me see it made real. And then that's what hits him when he sees Monadnock, is he feels like he has finally seen it made real, which is an interesting formulation in and of itself, but I'll leave that for Sherri. But I just wanted to, I've realized—
Before you screen share, I just have a quick question. Can you hear any music in the background now?
Nope.
Okay.
Because Oscar's playing his violin downstairs.
We've got a young violinist downstairs playing and it doesn't.
All right. So here we're going to have the Tchaikovsky opening of Tchaikovsky's first concerto.
Can you all see this? Okay, good.
Okay, I think we could keep going because it's a great piece, but that gives you an idea for it. And now the real gem here I found here is this version. There's no actual video with it, just a still photo. But this is Rachmaninoff playing his second piano concerto, the third
movement.
All right. So that gives you a sample of it.
It's a little mean that you stop.
Oh, I'm so sorry, but we don't have time. We just play the whole thing and then, yeah. Now, I think it's interesting, two things. First of all, it's interesting that Ayn Rand, as a Russian writer, chose two Russian composers. She had a, there's clearly that Russian impact or that Russian sensibility that was coming through. It's also, in the current context, I find it interesting that, Russia currently has this whole sort of inferiority complex that it's working out on Ukraine about how, they feel they ought to rule the world and they don't, so they're going to take it all out on Ukraine, or at least that's Vladimir Putin's complex. But this goes to show you that there was a time in which Russia had this leading position in the world by producing the world's greatest writers and the world's greatest composers. The Russian novelists and the Russian composers were the very, very best in the world. So they had a different vision of national greatness that they were achieving about 100 to 150 years ago. But also, when Ayn Rand tells you these, when she gives you these two musical cues, she's giving you a clue really to her sense of life and to what sort of embodies her view of the world. And you'll notice that there's this incredible high drama and overwhelming passion and really, high highs and low lows and very bright spots and very dark undercurrents in the music. So it really gives you a sense for all the very high drama she's working into this novel. That's basically, she's taking what she hears in the music and trying to say, I want a novel that matches that level of, extreme drama to it. And extreme contrasts. But the other thing I find fascinating about this is she says, men have not found the words for it, nor the deed, nor the thought, but they have found the music. Now, this is interesting to me personally because there's a view in among sort of objectivist philosophers who come after Ayn Rand, where she had a whole theory that ideas move the world, that that it's philosophical ideas that influence history and move the big events of history. And sometimes that's interpreted in this, I think, a very narrow way to say that, well, a philosopher comes along, he writes a treatise, and therefore ideas, events sort of flow out from that. But here, and I've written some things sort of trying to. I sort of got in a lot of trouble in the objectivist movement by writing some new ideas about how it is actually the ideas influence history. And one of the points I make in there is that oftentimes when a new idea is in the process of being grasped, it is grasped in art before it's grasped in ideas. So I point out, or it's grasped in history or in the sciences. A new idea starts to develop there before the philosophers come along. So I point out in ancient Greek history, you have this tremendous outburst of ancient Greek art, and the vase paintings and the sculptures is all happening for a couple hundred years. You have Greek sciences is beginning to develop. You have the play, the great Greek tragedies being written, and all this sort of stuff happens over a period of a couple of years, and then only at the end do you get somebody like Aristotle who comes along and puts it all into words and makes it into a philosophy. And here Ayn Rand, I think, is pointing to the same phenomenon, that an idea, a whole approach to life that influenced her, that she's the philosopher who's going to come up with these ideas to try to explain what that approach to life is. But where'd she get it from? Well, she got it first from listening to Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. And so, it's something that before people found the words for it, they found the music for it, is basically, and that's exactly what she's saying here. And I find that interesting too, because that's a good segue to the thing I was planning to talk about today. And that is the section later on, and I just lost it, but it was on 550. Oh, here it is. Yeah, here it is. Yeah. The section later on in a little bit after that, where she talks about the meaning, where Howard Roark explains to us the meaning of life.
And it's not 43.
It's 551. Oh, no, you're getting ahead of me here. So he explains to us the meaning of life. And I find that a very interesting way of putting it, because it's a kind of, it seems, as someone who came to Ayn Rand through through Atlas Shrugged first, and then read The Fountainhead later, and someone who came to her through her philosophical, her nonfiction philosophical essays before reading this. It's a very different way of putting it. She never uses a phrase like the meaning of life elsewhere. So let me just read this section, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This is he and Gail Wynand are going off to the site for Wynand's house, and they're having a series of conversations, and it's the beginning of this sort of connection of these two people who are going to have this very explosive combination of Howard Roark and Gail Wynand. And here it just starts with Gail Wynand speaking. I was thinking of people who say that happiness is impossible on earth. Look how hard they all try to find some joy in life. Look how they struggle for it. Why should any living creature exist in pain? By what conceivable right can anyone demand that a human being exists for anything but his own joy? Every one of them wants it. Every part of him wants it, but they never find it. I wonder why. They whine and they say they don't understand the meaning of life. There's a particular kind of people that I despise. Those who seek some sort of higher purpose or universal goal, who don't know what to live for, who moan that they must find themselves. You hear it all around us. That seems to be the official bromide of our century. Every book you open, every drooling self-confession. It seems to be a noble thing to confess. I think it'd be the most shameful one. Look, Gail, Roark got up, reached out, tore a thick branch off a tree, held it in both hands, one fist closed at each end. Then his wrists and knuckles tensed against the resistance. He bent the branch slowly into an arc. Now I can make what I want of it: a bow, a spear, a cane, a railing. That's the meaning of life. Your strength, your work. He tossed the branch aside. The material the earth offers you and what you make of it. All right, so that's Howard Roark explaining to us the meaning of life. You take a branch off the tree, you bend it, you can turn it into whatever you need. You take the material of the earth and you make it into something that serves your needs. Now, I mentioned that it's very rare for Ayn Rand to talk in terms of the meaning of life, and I think it's because it's kind of a vague phrase. So there's a well-known science fiction series that I read when I was a kid, a little bit before I read The Fountainhead, or before I read Ayn Rand, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the sort of recurring running joke in the whole plot is that there's these aliens who built this giant computer the size of a planet, and they ask it to determine for them the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And this computer chugs away for millions of years and finally produces the answer. And the answer is 42. And everybody's looking at each other like, well, what does that mean? Well, the problem is that nobody ever actually defined what the question was. And so, I when I was in high school, I was reading one of those Douglas Adams is the author, reading one of these Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, and one of the other students comes up to it and says 42, and it was like this secret catchphrase you had that you were aware of this. It started as a radio series on BBC and then became a series of books.
I didn't realize I was jumping ahead.
Yeah, you were jumping ahead of me there. Anyway, but it just gets the problem that people tend not to define what the question is when they say the meaning of life. It's this vague thing. What does it mean for life to have meaning? And I noticed this is, I came across stuff recently, but this is a guy I think who's also, he was like a colleague of Jordan Peterson at University of Toronto, who's done this series of lectures, what he calls the meaning crisis. And I'm not so sure why, I don't think he has really great answers to it, but this idea of it, that there's a meaning crisis, and that people have lost the sense of having a clear idea of what gives meaning and purpose to your life, and then having to search to find that. And I think that's absolutely true today. And I find that to be the case, I think that's a lot of what's driving a lot of the culture war you see out there is actually, now if you back up a little bit, I've seen a lot of polls recently, and over the last 30 years, a very interesting development, which is that America is becoming a far more secular country. So if you look at, these are polls that cover the religious belief, They cover how often people go to church and things like that. And you see it basically over the last 30 years kind of going off a cliff. That church attendance is way down. People who consider themselves aligned with a particular denomination, the sort of people who describe themselves as nothing in particular in terms of their religious beliefs are now, there's more of those people. It's about almost a third of the population. There are more of them than there are evangelical Christians. And so I think part of the problem we have, though, is that without religion as something that gives people a sense of what is the meaning, what gives meaning and purpose to your life, they're left with looking for something else, right? And so the question is, can they find something else? And so what Ayn Rand really here is offering here is, I've been writing a number of articles recently using this exact passage from The Fountainhead, because I think what Ayn Rand is offering is this like third alternative in the culture wars of saying, well, here is what gives meaning and purpose to your life, which is work and achievement. Taking the material offered to you by nature and making something of it, coming up with a new idea, building something new. And I did a piece recently about workism. So this is somebody complaining that the problem we have today is workism, people trying to find meaning, people looking for work to provide meaning and value to their life. That's like, well, that's exactly the solution that we need. That's exactly it's way better than all the other alternatives being offered to people out there. But I think in the culture war, what you have is you have people either trying to go back to traditional religion as a source of meaning and purpose in life, or people looking to some sort of political activism as what gives meaning and purpose to their life, rather than the actual thing you spend most of your life doing, which is, the work that you choose to do. And this is connecting back to that very speech Rourke gives at the very, very beginning when he has that meeting with the dean at Stanton Institute of Technology, where he says, I'm going to spend the next 60 years of my life, doing this work. Why shouldn't it be something that I enjoy, that is chosen by me, where I'm giving it my own, I'm putting my own meaning and value into this. So that's the idea of what was derided as workism is really the alternative that Ayn Rand's offering as a secular source of meaning and value in life, is the idea of, taking, what's the phrase she uses here, that Rourke uses, taking the material the earth offers you and then making something out of it that serves human needs and expresses your vision of life. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that in that passage about the music, she says that they found the music for it, but they haven't found the words for it. And in The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand is beginning to find the words for her approach to life. She hasn't found all the words yet. And I think that's why you get this sort of Howard Rourke talking about the meaning of life. In her later novels, you're going to get long philosophical speeches. At the end of this novel, you're going to get a longish semi-philosophical speech, right? But she hasn't gone into the full giving philosophical speeches section of her literary career yet, because she's still finding the words to explain what it is that she's trying to convey, to explain her view of the world. She's still beginning to define this. She's defining it more in terms of creating characters and creating dramatic actions than she has done in finding the philosophical definition of it. So it's really, it's going to take until sometime in the 1950s, basically, when she's writing Atlas Shrugged, and specifically when she takes, I think she takes a couple of years in Atlas Shrugged, she takes a couple of years just to write Galt's speech. So it's this long philosophical speech there. And that's where she really defines in full philosophical terms the sort of things that she's beginning to, the ideas she's beginning to develop here in The Fountainhead. And she's going to return back to this idea of this phrase of this is the meaning of life. In a way, she never returns to that formulation of saying this is the meaning of life. She never uses those words, because for her later on, I think they are too inexact. It's like, what is the question? If you're looking for the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, what is the question? So she thinks she found that that formula is too inexact for her later on, which she's defining this in explicit philosophical terms. But she does end up talking about the meaning of life, and in a very, very specific sense. So, and this is something that comes out in Galt's speech that she writes during the 1950s. It comes out in some essays she wrote on the objectivist ethics in the early 1960s. And she comes up with the idea that it's the concept of life becomes central to her ethics and to her morality. And in a way that I think shines a little deeper level gives a deeper level of meaning to this passage about bending the stick and showing it to be the meaning of life. So in her view, morality all comes from the requirements of a living being. And the idea is a living being, life is self-generated, self-sustaining action. So a living being faces the basic imperative of, in order to maintain the processes of life, in order to maintain life, every living being has to go out and do certain things. It has to get certain nutrients from its environment. It needs to, an animal, a plant needs to grow towards the sunlight. An animal needs to hunt whatever its natural prey is. And then human beings also, like all the other animals, they have to do something. They have to go build and change their environment in a way that produces food, gives them shelter from the elements, that serves the biological requirements of the existence of life. The idea is life always constantly requires more energy feeding into it, more food, more protection from the elements in order to maintain itself. So it's this idea of the self-sustaining activity of life. And that's her idea, is that is what produces the basis for morality. That morality comes from the fact that life gives you, that the requirements of life give you certain things that you have to do, certain things you must pursue and things you must achieve. And that should be the basis of that. The requirements of human life should be the basis of morality. Now, what's added for humans as opposed to animals is the fact that the primary thing you have to do is think. And then in order to think and direct your actions, you have to you have to make choices. So that's what produces a morality. An animal, there's no morality for animals because they don't have a choice as to what they do. They do whatever they're sort of programmed to do by their genetic inheritance, by whatever's been trained into them. So that, they have certain training or instincts that have programmed them to do certain things. For a human being, you have to engage in higher level thinking. You have to, come up with abstract rules. You have to go by choice, and that's why you would need a morality. But it all comes down to what Howard Roark is saying here, that the needs of life mean you have to take the material of the world around you and you have to reshape it in a way that will be self-sustaining, that will sustain the needs of human life. And so later on in philosophy, in the realm of abstract philosophy, she will find the words to fully and explicitly and sort of technically lay out how what Howard Roark says here about the meaning of life, how that actually is, how it shows that life itself and the requirements of life, the nature of life as self-directed, self-generated, self-sustaining action gives rise to the whole field of morality. It's at the basis of morality. It is the basis of what gives meaning and purpose to human life. So she's going to define that much more explicitly and fully in her later philosophy. And here we're seeing with Howard Roark is that the very first statement, essentially, of what would later become her objectivist ethics. So that's what I find fascinating about this. And I think that's why that earlier passage that I wasn't planning to talk about, that earlier passage about how you haven't found the words for it, but we found the music. Here she's finding this sort of early words for something that she'll find a lot more words for later on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I really love this point about, art, being able to see it, because if you look at the boy on the bicycle, right, he's seeing it. He doesn't have words for it. He's seeing it. At some point, he has to find words for it so that he can use it to guide his life and shape his life. But initially, it is kind of a feeling of something is missing, I need something. And then here is something concrete which we can see, which is art, that shows, okay, it is possible, it's real. Now let me see what exactly it is, and let me try to formulate it, and then build my out. Go ahead.
I really had a breakthrough on that when we were, this is what, 2004, 2005, when we were in London and we're at the British Museum, and they have this incredible, this great collection of the early vase paintings. And you can see, you can just watch, they have it arranged chronologically, and you see something like something as huge is going on in this culture just by looking at what they painted on the sides of their wine jugs, you know, because you see this a much higher degree of realism, much more subtlety and nuance in the lines that they use, and the way they're able with these very simple drawings to much more accurately convey what the human form is, and to create this vision of a sort of ideal human form just by painting with, you know, with glaze on the side of a pot. And you can see this is all happening really early on in like the early 500s, you know, the 600s and early 500s BC. All this is happening really early on, but you can really see it happening, that there's something going on in the brains of the Greeks at that time that is causing them to be much more capable of observing reality and of grasping the nature of things, and of then representing a heroic view of life through their painting.
Exactly. And you see the same thing with Ayn Rand. Have we lost Rob and Sherri? Oh, they're back.
Did we?
You see? Yeah, there was a pause. That's fine. You see the same thing with Ayn Rand. You know, she's developing her entire art, and what that is doing is that it is giving her insight into exactly how human beings function at all different levels. And when she's finally formulating things, all of that is behind her. It's the base for formulation, as opposed to some philosophers who just produce some ideas just out of their head, you know, with some kind of smattering of observation, just jump directly to a concept and then try to deduce everything from there. So
I'll have to read you some Leibniz sometime.
No, please don't.
Can I not be there?
It is the pure essence of, here, let me go through this deductive chain and not observe reality at any point in the process.
No.
Actually, the example I use on that, the standing example I use on that, which I found out about years ago, and I find it fascinating, is that both Descartes and Locke, Descartes and Newton, within a few decades of each other, wrote treatises on physics. Descartes starts very much with that approach, which is central to his whole philosophy of, I'm going to look inward at my concepts, and I'm going to deduce from there. I'm going to make a whole chain of deductions about what the nature of the world has to be based on my concept, the existing concept in my head of what matter is. And he uses that to write this whole treatise on physics and on the motion of the planets and all of that, based on entirely from deducing from the concept of his existing concepts. And it's all completely wrong. And then a couple of decades later, Newton comes along and basically looks outward, and based on experiments done by Galileo and other people, comes up with this series of observations that he then draws conclusions from those observations. So it's a great example of two totally different approaches, that deducing everything and not looking at reality, versus starting on this experimental base of all this information that had been learned by Newton and by people who came before him, and then coming up with concepts that integrate all of those observations. So and he comes up with he adds new things to the concept of matter. He just doesn't say, what's my existing concept of what matter is. He adds new things to it because it's based on the observation. So it's a great example of those two different approaches. And of course, Newton produces something that's correct instead of something that's completely wrong.
Yes, and Descartes' statement, I think, therefore I am, actually captures the error in the most succinct way. It's like, even am, you're saying I think, and then you're going to deduce reality from it.
And that is actually very specifically what he does. And Ayn Rand answers it later by saying, you have to reverse that error by saying, I am, therefore I'll think.
Yes.
But one other thing that Sherri's putting out to me, and I was going to mention this before, is in this exchange on the meaning of life that he has with Gail Wynand. when he says, that's the meaning of life, Gail Winan says, your strength. And he says,
Question
no,
mark.
your work. And so it's interesting that Winan thinks of it in terms of strength, because it's strength, to him, it's strength
Power.
of will and it's power that is psychologically how he thinks about it. And Rourke being more outward focused on, what is it you're actually doing? He says, not your strength, your work. And that's, in a way, I think this is sort of her answer to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche has, in his philosophy, it's very much about your strength of will, and the strength of will, the sort of internal psychological focus on your will and your ability to endure and to push through. That is his whole focus of his philosophy. And whereas she's saying the focus should be outward, it shouldn't be on your will, it should be on what it is that you're doing in the world. It should be on the world, on the actual thing you're accomplishing in reality.
This is also her pointing out, this is the error that Gail makes, and this is the beginning of him starting to recognize that error that he made long ago.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Next up is Maritza.
So, in these 5 chapters is the beginning of how it works. First, I'd like to point out to you guys that in this section 4, we don't begin with the story of the named person of their childhood. In every previous part, when we began the section, we were introduced to that person as a child. I believe the statement that we're being told here is, remember, how it would work is the ideal. So we're being told that the ideal faces forward, doesn't look back. My opinion, but that's how I interpreted that. It's the writer's style of not presenting us with all of the childhood history as she did for the other named parts. And then we've spoken about this the picture painted in this first section of the first chapter in this 4th part. The imagery of the boy on the bicycle, it's come up so often for so many things we've done. And I'm not going to overhash everything. And thank you again, Rob, for playing the music. The thing here is there's a boy who's making a supplication in his mind. He's driving and he doesn't even realize he's praying. He's putting a desire out into the world, and miraculously in his mind, it's answered. And what's really impactful to me is what he's saying to the universe. He's saying that he wants to see something that says to him, don't work for my happiness, my brothers. Show me yours. Show me that it is possible. Show me your achievement. And the knowledge will give me courage for mine. That supplication, that's a prayer, is how it reads to me. And I think in today's world, that's something that I'm sure we can see in others, especially the young. In a world where ever increasingly, it's so easy to drift and just float and be a second-hander. I would imagine there's a lot of people with this plea in mind. And imagine having this plea and having it answered. And, he talks to Rourke for all of like a minute or two. And when he looks at Rourke, he speaks freely. And actually, Winan does further on in this section that we've read, in a different, in the next chapter, we'll see it's the same thing. They don't need words. They just look at each other and feel free to speak in a manner that they would not usually do with others. I'm reminded of something she says and has said to us several times now in other discussions. It's like when you're giving us the definition of namaste, I think you're saying the soul within me greets the soul within you. I imagine that what we're being shown here is that, when you say like recognizes like, that image of the boy looking at Rourke and knowing this is a like-minded soul. That's what Winan and Rourke see in each other. Another interesting small thing to point out is that this is the first section where you start seeing Howard Rourke instead of just work. Just a small, another, an artistic detail and style of the author, but we're humanizing the ideal here. So we're bringing you this ideal that's been on the pedestal for the last several sections, and we're bringing it to your level to show you, sure, it's an ideal, but even ideals can walk among us in some part. So that's what I see here. And one more thing before I move on from the boy on the bicycle, Work watches him as the kid's riding his bicycle through the paths, and he says he'll never see him again. And then it says he did not know that he had given someone the courage to face a lifetime. Chills, right? Chills. So if we are just doing our own thing and living as close we can in accordance with our own sense of life, our very own principles and values, and holding true to those, hopefully at least once, will leave somebody with the courage to face a lifetime. I think that's amazing. Just the concept of that is just mind-boggling. And then I have to step back from that and move on. So, and then we get Howard Roark and Gail Wining meeting each other. And it's an explosive thing, but it's quiet fireworks. And both of them is baffled and surprised and at peace, all rolled up into one confusing package. The fascinating thing about these two is that you have, so we've been presented all along as work is the ideal. But Gail could have been. Remember, he wasn't supposed to be a first-hander, and that's spoilers, right? We'll get there. That will be stated explicitly. But for now, we're being spoon-fed all the ways in which Gail Winan had a chance to turn left and he turned right. Or even turning right, he could have made something of it. The fascinating thing about these next couple chapters is that we see very, very strongly Gail questioning choices in life. He has no regrets, which is admirable, but he wonders if some of his convictions may require revisiting. So the boy on the bicycle was seeking for something to show him that, this existence had some meaning. And in chapter 2, when Roark and Winan first meet, there's an interesting section there that I wanted to just give you just a little quote there that I thought was fascinating, because when they meet each other, they're just talking on this level that neither of them expected. And, there's this line here, it says, "We live in our minds, and existence is the attempt to bring that life into physical reality and to state it in gesture and form." Those of us who've all walked together with Louis Sullivan and explored his concepts, both the imagery that Rob presented us in the tree branch and bending it to your work and your creativity. And then this comment here about bringing life to physical reality. That's what we're saying. We're bringing the ideal down into the real, because the ideal is necessary. We cannot lose sight of it, but you can't live there, right? So remember, this is a work of fiction, and Howard Roark, while he's the ideal, us mere humans can perhaps strive for something real. And we're shown that here as you see this interaction here. And I think it's interesting because they're talking about building. So Roark and Winan are in a roundabout way asking each other, well, why on earth do you want to build something now? Why haven't you built anything before? You've got all this money. And Roark's telling him that, if building a house is a testament to your life, a man who doesn't build when he has the means, it's because his life has not been what he wanted. And they don't go deeper into that there, not explicitly, but throughout the next chapters, we are spoon-fed that same concept. Because he asks Roark, he tells Roark, I do not always like being Gail Winan. And about 2 seconds later, he asked him, do you always like being Howard Rourke? And Howard Rourke didn't even have to answer. He saw it in his face. He knew the answer. He didn't let him say yes. And that's, I had to stop for a moment and ask myself, have I always liked being myself? Have I always liked being Maritza? And sadly, I thought the answer was no. But then when you think about the moments that I thought the answer was no, I realized that it wasn't necessarily that I didn't like being myself. I didn't like being in that moment. So I don't know. I probably have to sit in a corner a little longer and unpack that. But these are all things, if you put yourself in the shoes of either of them, it's really interesting because, again, we can't all of us be Howard Rourke 100% of the time. But if we could strive, I think that I would find it to be a life well lived, if I can say for the most part. I've always enjoyed being me. So just that was the thought that came there. And they're talking about, this, the why. So he's never done anything for himself. He's trying to get this house built because he's trying to do a monument to his happiness, is what he says. And he tells Rourke that he sees in his buildings one sense above it all. And he says it's a sense of joy. And that's fascinating. He says, not a placid joy, a difficult, demanding kind of joy, the kind that makes one feel as if it were an achievement to experience it. One looks and thinks, I'm a better person if I can feel that. And Rourke finds himself shocked that someone can see that someone can see these things in his buildings, because Rourke hasn't, in general, attempted to make anyone see anything. Rourke follows his own compass. And so what others may see or may not see is immaterial in general. But it's, this concept that we're being shown, this idea of that forward movement as we walk through life should have this idea that the energy needed to keep propelling ourselves on the forward path requires the occasional sightings of something that makes us think that we're a better person for having felt something while viewing it. And that's the point that Ayn Rand tells us when she's talking about the arts. And in Romantic Manifesto, we explored that theme, the theme that we have a need for seeing the sense of life concretized. And that's the theme that she presents to us here. And you see it in the interaction between Winan and Rourke. And like I've said before, that the mastery of the writing also on its own, we could have a conversation separately. Something else that we're presented here is the diametrically opposing views that Rourke and Winan hold, even though at the core, they have so many similarities. And it's interesting because in the second chapter, Winan tells us that, some things don't matter. He's like, they were the means, you're the end. So he's talking about all the buildings that he's like apologizing for having built. And in his own way, he's showing us that even though he says he regrets nothing, that's what he's saying. But what he's expressing is regrets and remorses, because he's saying they were the means, you're the end. And he's also talking about not always liking being himself, and how the house he's building is a prison for this person that he's hopelessly in love with. And those facets show to us the difference between himself and Rourke. Gail views anything for which he might hold value as something that he has to hold on to so tightly that he runs the risk of breaking it. And so, when we talk about and if we go forward, and I'm gonna skip some of my notes here. If you go forward to the where's that I want to talk about? It's the yes and no, the question of yes and no. That is in chapter 4, of this section and around page 39, 40. So Howard is talking to us about the fact that the ability to say yes or no is the essence of all ownership. And we're talking about essences again, right? And so it's an ownership to your ego and to your soul, as it were. And you guys recall my favorite line: in order to say I love you, one must first be able to say the I. Well, that is a direct corollary here with another statement, which he says, you can't say yes without saying I. There's no affirmation without the one who affirms. And so again, here we see this concept of, yes, there is value in community, in society, in culture, but without a strong individual, you just can't get there. You cannot get there. And I see that here in Ayn Rand, and this has shaped so many of my beliefs throughout the years. So, and every time I read it, I see it just a little bit more clearly and a little bit differently. And it's just fascinating, because another aspect that he's saying when he's talking about this idea of ownership of your soul, everything to which you grant your love is yours. And he's saying that saying yes or no, because he says yes or no, so affirming, making an affirmation is a small act of love. And that's so powerful if one looks at it from a philosophical perspective. And it's so rare. And he's looking at Winan, and Winan moves forward in life with a closed mind perspective. If there should be anything that approximates any type of love for him, he wants to close it out and shut it away. Now, work is expressing to him that the opposite happens. If you truly do love something, it's open, and it doesn't matter how often it's shared or with whom, because the affirmation, if you have a strong enough I, someone else viewing your love can't change it. You don't have to lock it away in a cellar because it's immaterial. The simple idea of you, and I've said this glibly before to people, oh, you can't steal someone who doesn't want to be stolen. That seems silly, right? But if you think about the fact, if there's a relationship and you're truly in love, somebody can throw themselves naked. They can just be whole harems of folks throwing themselves at this person. But if they're in love with someone, truly, it's immaterial. If you're strong, if your core, your I, your soul is solid, immaterial, just immaterial, right? Now, this is my perspective. I love so Winan is trying to wrap his mind around this. And he's like, oh, I like this concept. That means your office is mine. I suspect he's missing the point a little bit, but he's trying to see it. And he asked the question, well, this yes, once granted, can it be withdrawn? And Works answers with one word: never. It's not expanded upon at this time, but it will be in time. So it's an interesting thought there, that if you open yourself to affirming something, or the opposite of affirming it, if you affirm it in the negative, that's out there, and it's out there forever. And it doesn't mean that you're rigid, that like, oh, once you've made up your mind, you can never change it, because that's part of the growing process. But it's a matter of, once you have the ability to make a strong affirmation, the odds of you being unable to make a strong affirmation are going to be very low to nil. Here in the book, we're told never. That's the idea. And along this idea of, having the affirmation to say yes. So Winan, throughout all these chapters, Winan keeps asking questions. He looks at work almost like he's a rare alien that he doesn't understand. And yet, so many times he says, we have the same, we come from the same place. And he's baffled why, if they came from the same place, they ended up so differently. He says that many times. You see that throughout the chapters. And so he's talking about, Winan asks him, do you notice the stops in your life? Or is it just a constant typewriter without end? And Rourke says, sure, I notice the stops. And he's asking him, he's like, well, I never noticed mine. Like, what's the reason until this? Why am I having these stops? And Rourke tells him, don't look for a reason. Just acknowledge the stop. And I think that points again to a steadfastness. And in looking, and again, Ayn Rand is pointing out to us the folly of spending too much time looking back if what you're seeking is the ideal. And this, she goes over this also because they have a point about talking about integrity. So in I think it's chapter 3, when Rourke comes back to show the drawings to Winan attempts to treat Rourke as he's treated everything else that he wants to collect and put in his vault, if he sees them as value. And we see it because when they were having a conversation, when they were on the land, at the very end, Winan shut down. He saw something in Rourke that he decided this person was so noble and so admirable a person, I have to own him. Well, it's not said in the book. That's my extrapolation. And the reason I extrapolate that is the next time that they meet, he attempts to control Rourke. He wants to tie him up and lock him into his vault, like he does with all his treasured things. And Rourke turns the table and tries to do it to him, or shows him how it would look if it were done to him. Basically, he's saying, sure, I'll consent to that if you consent to a house that looks basic like all these other, monstrosities that you don't like. And because remember, they've already had a conversation about the house being the monument to one's life. So he turns it around and says, you wouldn't stand for that. Why on earth would you think I would? Why do you think that would work on me? And so he tells him to shut up because, mine doesn't go for it. But Winan says, well, didn't you take a terrible chance here? And Rourke says, no, none at all. I had an ally in my side that I could trust. And Gail goes, what, your integrity? So we know that Gail sees integrity in Howard. But Howard says to him, no, yours, Gail. And the interesting thing here is that we then learn that Gail doesn't think he's a man of integrity. He doesn't. Even though we see constantly he's saying he has no regrets. He stands by his past decisions. But he doesn't think he's a man of integrity. We're going to see a little bit more how that plays into this, the whole concept of, seeking the ideal and forward movement. And so that one, I want to just talk about one more concept here before I shut up. The idea of cooperation versus collaboration. Now that comes up when Rourke is asked to be on the team for the March of the Millennials. I think it's not the March of the Millennials. I'm making that up. The March of the Ages. And so when he's asked to be on that team of 8, he said he'll only accept it if he can do all the work. And obviously they wanted everybody to be together. So he didn't do it. And, folks are thinking he's being arrogant. And Winan asks him about it. And what I want to point that out because I really love the distinction he makes. So first, I'd like to read to you guys the Webster Dictionary for collaborate and the Webster Dictionary definition for cooperate. Collaborate is to work jointly on an activity, especially to produce or create something. The definition for cooperate is to work jointly towards the same end. And that's fascinating because Howard Rourke tells Winan that he can and is willing to cooperate with others, but he does not view that his work is such that he can collaborate. And so in his mind, to collaborate is a settling that he won't do. And the fascinating thing here is I think that in today's world, we really are confused as to what those two means. I think we use them interchangeably when they're really not. Because if you're working jointly towards the same end, it means I'm leading to my strengths. And a slight spoiler here is when you get further on, you go to chapter 9 here in this section, there's an interplay between Keating and Rourke, where Rourke tells him, see, this is my idea of collaboration. And he describes the definition of cooperation. He says, I will handle the drawing, you will handle the people. We'll play up to our strengths. And that is a lost concept, I think. But I like here, as we read this book and the philosophy is unfurled, the invitation to own up with pride those things that are your strengths and acknowledge when it's prudent to allow someone else to cooperate with you because they have a strength that is greater than yours. It does not make one lesser, and it's not just out of arrogance. So I really, really like, it was just very softly pointed out, but that's the view that I saw there, and I thought it was really an interesting thing to share here. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Maritza. I really loved your description of the interaction between Wynand and Howard Rourke. I'm glad that we have done with the first three parts, because now part 4 is all about Howard Rourke and two people. It is Wynand and Dominique. What is it that is common to them? And what is it that is different from them? Both Dominique and Wynand actually have the ideal completely, fully, in the most intense form. They're completely committed to that. So they have the, again, connecting it with the art, they have the artistic reaction to what Howard Rourke is, not just as another person, but that within their own soul, they have that too. And what is it that they are missing? They are missing the question of, is that something that is natural in the world or not? It is relationship of that artistic ideal, whether it is implementable in the world. That is the question for them. And each of them, we're going to see throughout this process, each of them deal with that. So it's all about kind of art. Can you make that art part of your life, part of the world? Or do you have to lock it away in the vault? Is it something that belongs, or do you have to throw it down the shaft? Is it, if you do build it, like the Stoddard Temple, is it going to be, is it determined that it's going to be destroyed by the world? Or you can make that work? That is the question. Both of them are struggling. So now Peter Keating is behind us, Ellsworth too is behind us. It's all about that. So wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
I also find, really quick, Shika, I also find that the this fourth part is the heaviest on Ayn Rand's philosophy. It like stated more explicitly.
Yes, and it's beautiful to have. See, if you look at it as an art of, work of art, it's very beautiful. So you have these two lines going, right? You have Gail Wynand trying to figure things out, and you have Dominique trying to figure things out, each in their different way. Each, actually, Wynand faces things far more explicitly. And it is all, his decisions are all about, what is he going to do? What is he going to do about the house? What is he going to do about the papers? What is he going to do about the trials? What is he going to do after the trial? What is it? So it's all kind of external. Whereas for her, it is all internal. So the way they face, but it's the same issue that they are facing. And we are going to see it unfurl. This particular issue, is the ideal practical? That is the question. and they are going to, rest of the part 4 is about that. Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Sherri.
Hi, everybody. I just love how we all flow from one another, because what Maritza is saying, you took a bunch of things I didn't need to say now because you took care of it. So then I can go into a few other things. So that means I get to start with color and end with color with a little architectural theory in the middle. So I'm going to start here with this absolutely brilliant description of the color green. And you notice I wore green today. It's not in the least bit spring here. It was yesterday, but today it snowed. But I'm going to start here at the beginning of our chapter 1, part 4. The boy, again, the scene of the boy of the bicycle. The leaves streamed down, trembling in the sun. They were not green. Only a few scattered through the torrent stood out in single drops of a green so bright and pure that it hurt the eyes. The rest were not a color, but a light, the substance of fire on metal, living sparks without edges. And it looked as if the forest were a spread of light boiling slowly to produce this color. This green rising in small bubbles, the condensed essence of spring. The trees met, bending over the road, and the spots of sun on the ground moved with the shifting of the branches, like a conscious caress. The young man had hoped he would not have to die. Not if the earth could look like this, he thought. Not if he could hear the hope and the promise like a voice, with leaves, tree trunks, and rocks instead of words. And then further down the page, we have this. He did not face nature with the joy of a healthy animal as a proper and final setting. He faced it with the joy of a healthy man, as a challenge, as tools, means, and material. So he felt anger that he should find exaltation only in the wilderness, and that this great sense of hope had to be lost when he would return to man and men's world and men's work, excuse me. He thought that this was not right, that man's work should be of a higher step, an improvement on nature, not a degradation. And then later on, right after this line about the 2 pieces of music, and they had found the words, but let me see it in one single act of man on earth. This line, let me see it made real. So that introduction there, I think, is the beginning of why, one of the deeper elements of why she chose architecture for this theme that she is deeply sinking into. See, she is a fiction writer, so she can make real an entire world in her book. And the thing that architecture can do beyond any of the other arts is make a world that is unique and real and in its own little spot. Now, we've seen several cases earlier on in the earlier chapters of this book where we're seeing the power that Howard Roark's architecture has on other people. We see it with Austin Heller. We see it with the Sanborn house. Remember the Sanborn's eldest son, who I think drinks heavily, refuses to speak with anyone. There's a squabble over who's the wife doesn't want a modern house. The husband's worn out by the whole thing, though he loves the house. They all take off, but this son, who was previously in this kind of sinking into a self-destructive situation, changes because he can live in this house. This house is now providing that made real for him. And so I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about why suddenly we get this pairing of the boy on the bicycle and the monadnock. This whole setting is because here we've seen bits of Howard Roark's architecture, but this is the beginning of this last section. And all of a sudden, we have not just a house, a building, a skyscraper surrounded by the rest of the world. Here we have an entire environment. When the boy on the bicycle crests that hill and there's that big circle of sky and he looks down upon the Monadnock Valley, it's an entire world, complete and unique. And that's the thing that gives him that courage. So I wanted to go into detail of how it is that these individual houses on this hillside have this sense of life reaction for him. And we talk about, when we did the Romantic Manifesto, we talked about how fiction and architecture show that whole world and how it's an enveloping environment. We talked about it in fiction details of how it builds up to a sense of life. We did a lot of discussion about paintings and sculptures, of how the details of that work form that sense of life reaction. So I wanted to do this a little bit with this scene. So we get first, let me make sure I get the right spot. Okay, in the broad valley, far below him, in the first sunlight of the early morning, he saw a town. Only it was not a town. Towns did not look like that. He had to suspend the possible for a little while longer. There were small houses on ledges of the hill before him, flowing down to the bottom. He knew that the ledges had not been touched and no artifice had altered the unplanned beauty of the graded steps. Yet some power had known how to build on those ledges in such a way that the houses became inevitable, and one could no longer imagine the hills as beautiful without them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how that works. So we have, let me continue. There's another detail I need to get to. Skip this part. As if the centuries and the seasons, the series of chances had produced these ledges in the struggle of great blind forces, had waited for their final expression, had been only a road to a goal. And the goal was these buildings. The houses were plain fieldstone, like the rocks jutting from the green hillsides. So there's something in that little line that really tells us something, and it gets at how architecture can present a sense of life. So we have these, and many architects in architecture schools will just throw this off as you should build with materials that are from the site. It doesn't really, that may be true, but it doesn't get to why. And the best way I can describe that is if by contrast, in far-ranging contrast. If you look at, and I'm sure you can all imagine, we've seen this a couple of weeks before, we showed Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And you've got these concrete terraces that reach out to the side, they're the same kind of color as the local area. And you have those tall structures in the center, the spines really, that are of the same rock of the surrounding area. Imagine that contrasted to the scene we get early on in the book with Mr. Mundy. Do you guys remember Mr. Mundy, who comes to Frank Lloyd Wright, or comes to Howard Roark early on to have him build a mansion? He wants this Randolph Place mansion that he remembered as a kid, essentially uprooted and rebuilt and plopped in a completely different environment. Imagine those two as contrast, and that will help kind of explain this a little bit more.
Actually, it reminds me about a half mile up here. There is.
I'm getting to that. See, I jumped in on him and he's jumping in on me. We didn't talk about this, but we still know. Okay, so if you go to why that material, what is it that individual materials from that site that are about that site, why does that make a difference? And I think it comes to this idea that it's of the place. It's they're showing, using those materials are showing a love of that specific environment and the beauty of that place. And it's doing something that really highlights the beauty of that unique site rather than working against it. It's that character that enhances and really integrates the architecture to the site and making the two together as greater than either part by themselves. So I think that gives a sort of a sense of life, of a love of a unique and individual location. Then we get on further in detail. This is something that I bring up with Rob a lot. There's a term we use in architectural history called vernacular architecture, which just means the architecture that's kind of just built by craftsmen from over years and years and years. It's the type of houses that are unique to a specific geographical region. And like, for example, and it's not even just within one country, you'll see the same kind of solution all across the world. So if you think wherever you are of houses that are in a really hot, sunny climate, they often have deep porches or porticos or some sort of structure. You see this all over Italy. It's a big part of their architecture. You see it in a way in the South here, Virginia, and further on south, it gets really, really hot and you need to seek for that shade. I'm sure in India, Shrikant and I are of a long overdue discussion about Indian residential houses, and I'm seeing a lot of that same kind of structure. These are needed for shade, but those are parts of, those are the element that help make that structure feel right and feel celebratory and of a particular place. Now you take that, say, southern deep porches and you plop it up in Minnesota, and it's like you're saying you hate one or the other. So you'll also get the same kind of thing with, in Virginia, we have a lot of red brick buildings, especially like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, University of Virginia, the whole university is all in red brick. And if you notice what the soil is here, it is completely that color. And there are aesthetic reasons for it because it feels like it comes from that space. But there's also a very practical reason for some of those choices of materials. For example, very often I see this around in Virginia where people will go against that because, oh, they're sick of red brick or something like that. And they'll go and they'll put, like, there was a house just down the road from Rob's parents that had a garden tour. And it was this complete square cube of a house, completely done in bright white. But of course, that sits in Virginia red clay. So every time it rains, the white cube, the perfect white cube, gets stained with red soil. So right before the garden tour, they had to repaint it really quickly. And I honestly think the paint might have actually been wet the day that we showed up, the first day of the garden tour. So there's elements here that are about the practical side of it too. It's that form follows function. That's part of it too. We've got the same kind of thing happens in any heavy snowfall. You often see a steeper pitched roof. That's again, what that's doing is both, it's shedding that snow off the roof. So there's a functional side to it, but then it ends up becoming part of the aesthetic, part of the love of the nature of that unique site. And where I grew up in the far northern Minnesota, you would often see little small windows and lots more walls and floor plans really centered around the big fireplace. That was the sign of the warmth. Now, that putting that in a place where there's a view that just, that just feels, again, it's so wrong when you mix these things up. But I don't think I see him on here today, but we have one of our regular guests here is in Norway with this, and we often see out his back window this beautiful view of the fjords. It's cold there too, but we've got new materials that have come along, and I'm pretty sure that his windows are triple pane so that he can have this big, wide, open view of this beautiful setting while not freezing his pants off in the winter. So there are changes that happen over time, but often you'll see those vernacular ideas. They're part of why something works in the area, in a specific area.
By the way, just the example I had in mind was the one that's a New England farmhouse that's just down the road here.
Oh, that's a totally different, yeah. So
Yeah.
Rob's talking about just another
Where-
house.
where the barn is like joins the house, so you don't have to go outdoors
Yeah,
because it's so cold, but it's in Virginia.
yeah, yeah. And those things always look awkward. They look, and again, it's you're putting it's like putting on a winter coat when you're on the beach. They don't fit together. But let me continue here. We've got another detail here that he brings up. We talk about the fieldstone, and then he talks about the way they're laid out. Let me see if I can find this. Many houses, they were small and they're cut off from one another. No two of them are alike, but they're like variations of a single theme, like a symphony played by an inexhaustible imagination. Now, one of these details that I really think is important here is they're individual. Each of these houses is unique. Now, each ledge and each little housing location within this Monadnock Valley is also unique. And so Howard Rourke takes that into consideration. Each one is unique. Compare that to what I was talking about last week with this international style and Bauhaus architecture, where every single detail of every single building is exactly the same. They're very much like bees in a hive. One detail I didn't mention last week that just came to mind, those apartment buildings that we looked at in Chicago, the 860 and 880 Lakeshore Drive, where every apartment is this little tiny cube and everything is done to the minimum size. One little detail that I didn't mention is that when that building was built, everybody had to adhere. They're not going to believe me. Everybody had to adhere to a rule that your shades in your apartment could be either all up or all the way down, or stopped at the mullion between the lower and upper windows. You weren't allowed to put your shades wherever you wanted to, because on the outside, it looked just really, really messy. So it was in your contract when you bought your condo where you were going to place your curtains. And of course, imagine if you're trying to sit there and read a book on a Sunday, maybe you're reading the paper Sunday morning and the sun is coming in from the lake, and geez, it's so bright, you can't see the words on the page. It'd be really nice if, okay, you could put the curtains all the way down, but you can't put them wherever you personally need them to be. So that's one of the details that sends a different level of a sense of life, of that it is about the individual and it's about their joy on their vacation in their own little world, their own little environment that's unique. It's not that we're all bees in a hive. It's not that this is all Soviet worker housing where everything is exactly the same as everybody else and everything is brought down to the barest minimum possible.
And your blinds all the same.
And your blinds are all at the same height, no matter what the sunlight is like. But the other thing that I wanted to mention in this little spot here is this detail that comes next. One could hear the laughter of the force that had been let loose on them. And I love this little detail. And it occurred to me, where do you see that? Where do you see that sort of almost laughter in the work? And you see that And it just, when I started thinking of it, there's a few different ideas that, or a few different people that really seem to resonate with me. And the first one was that sense of effortless work, but you know it isn't effortless. And the first thought that came to me was Simone Biles doing gymnastics. When, if any of you haven't seen her do this, search Simone Biles floor routine or whatever, and watch her. She is so effortless and she flies so high that when she finishes a tumbling run, there's like 6 extra feet of air before she comes down. And it's like she's playing. Everybody else is grunting and working hard. And to her, it's just play. And she's worked probably harder than anybody else has at it. Another example of this would be Luciano Pavarotti singing Nessa Dorma. Can you pull the shade for a second? When he sings it.
Wait, if you're gonna pull the shade, should it be all the way up, all the way down, or just halfway?
Just halfway. This one, honey.
Okay.
Just pull this curtain over. Sorry, I'm getting blinded, but I can put the shade wherever I want. But so you've got this same effortless and sort of joy in the work when you listen to Pavarotti sing, especially in his prime. Later on in his life, of course, his voice started getting a little bit more strained as the musculature got a little less supple. But you listen to him sing Nessa Dorma, and then you go listen to anybody else sing it, just about anybody else. Everybody else is really, really working. For him, it just flows out like honey. And you know that's come from a huge amount of work, but it's that joy in what he's doing that spills out. And I think that's what Ayn Rand is talking about here. It's, you look at Howard Roark's design of all these individual houses on this hillside, and he had so much fun creating them that sense of joy in the work just shows up in the finished piece. This is also an interesting touch. It's how I have learned to know when a floor plan is right. It's when I know it's complete, when it gets to the point where it looks so simple, like, well, of course it's that way. And sometimes this is a problem because, of course, I worked super, super hard to make that happen. But if you don't have the right client who understands it, it was like, well, you did nothing, you know. But that's how I know when it gets to its best state, is when it feels like it's effortless. And all that comes from, like I said, a huge amount of effort, but it's that love of the work that happens. So one of the things that I wanted to mention here, we've got our somebody who's joined us here today, and I wanted to mention this issue of thank you. It's that's another sense of the joy that Howard Roark is getting from his architecture. That, I mean, we hear this line that he doesn't know what's behind that thank you. I think he probably does. You know, you could see the look on the boy's face. I'm sure there was a lot of gravity in that thank you. I'm sure he knew what that meant. And I just wanted to give you a little detail of one of the best, most hilarious ways of getting a thank you that from a client. And we've got with us here right now, he is beautifully showing us one light on his ceiling.
That's like a
No, that's his ceiling light. Okay, so Jack is with us today. He's both a client of mine, but he's also was the best man at our wedding. So he's an old friend of ours. And he's showing
us old a bunch of times.
Old friend of ours.
Hi, Jack.
So, Jack is wandering around his apartment right now.
But we can't see anything.
No, we've seen the ceiling light.
Ah, okay.
But I wanted to, because I said I was going to get back to color. We're not going to get a whole tour of Jack's apartment or anything. I didn't give him any warning of this, but I wanted to tell you about one element of how you can come up with that sense of life. So I knew Jack for years before I was working on his condo. And I had known from Jack from all those years that he hated the month of November. It happens to be my favorite month because my birthday's in November, and Rob and I started our relationship in November, and Thanksgiving, when you make pumpkin pie, is in November. So to me, we always disagreed on this, but we had a long conversation once when he talked about November being the anti-life month. Now, November in Chicago is generally gray and rainy,
40 degrees,
40 degrees, chilly, you know, down to your bones kind of chill. And so when I was working on his apartment, I decided I was going to change that. So I chose colors in his apartment and materials that would make November be never, ever again the anti-life month. And so what I chose were colors that, as the sun, even if it was gray and cold outside, it always felt like the best parts of the fall, like where he's running around showing us a few things in a very herky-jerky way. They're all warm colors.
Just a second, let me go ahead and spotlight it so that people can see it. Give me just a second.
And he's showing us this on his phone, so it's not a really great rendition of the color, and he's going to give us all a little motion sickness. But all the colors in his apartment are these warm, almost fall colors. So the colors you would see in November when the leaves fell. And so all through the apartment, there are all these colors. So, and when the sun, you can see the amount of lights he's got. I don't know, I think it was 60 linear feet of windows in here. So when the sun comes in, because there is sun or light, at least, whatever dreary gray day it is, it still glows like this beautiful fall autumnal feeling in his apartment. And so my thank you, Jack and I are like brother, sister, we squabble a lot. So I'm not going to get a thank you like the boy on the bicycle. My thank you was I got a call one day from Jack, who was he sick with the flu and couldn't leave his apartment. And it was all my fault because it was too sunny inside and too warm and icky and gray outside that he couldn't leave his apartment. So you can get your thank yous in a bunch of, now he's showing us the smoke detectors. Thanks, Jack. but you can create that sense of life just by color alone. And it can have a huge, huge impact. So I've had several clients that I focus generally on residential architecture. And now Jack is being Jack. He's going to show us the underside of his lampshade. But you can get that sense of life just from the color. Hi, Jack. And of course, that he's wearing blue. That's good. There was one time he said he couldn't, he wanted to know if he needed to color coordinate his clothes because otherwise he didn't match his apartment. So anyway, what I wanted to get here was this issue of the sense of life that can happen from any element of the architecture, from the color, from the layout, from the site. All of these different elements will lead into part of what creates a sense of life.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let me go ahead and stop spotlighting. Jack, nice to see you and your apartment. It's been a long time. Give me just a second.
Oh, here, I'll give you a better light to look at.
Okay, Jack, give me just a second. Let me see if I can stop spotlighting. Hold on.
Oh, that's better.
Okay, remove spotlight. All right. Okay. let's see. Guys, can you now see
We can see you.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay, perfect. So let me continue. So firstly, I have some comments. So I want to go back to the 4 movements of Beethoven. The book starts with Howard Rock laughed. And he's standing on those ledges, looking down upon them. That is the laugh. That is the laugh which has shaped the Monadnock Valley. That's exactly what it is. So just look at the entire book from Howard Rock's point of view. Remove everybody else. Just look at the beginning part and the Monadnock Valley. There is this laugh, the person standing on his own, naked, laughing, looking at a ledge. Fast forward, there it is, that laughing force. That's exactly the laughing force, which has transformed the nature. What has been involved in transforming the nature? It is understanding of nature, understanding of human beings, how human beings are part of nature, and being able to express that in the world. What good architecture does, what good art does, is it not only captures all the physical requirements, but all the requirements of human consciousness. So as you're walking through the house, it is suited for your consciousness. So all the requirements of consciousness and existence are met by good design. And the secret of Howard Rock is that he's just focused on these universal principles. He's focused on reality. He's focused on universal principles, which are the principles of nature and of human beings. And he's just building directly for that. Okay. So this is a clean picture without the other people in there. Okay. Now let's put the other people there. What are they doing? They are all focused on other people. All their problems are based on the fact that they're focused on other people. Peter Keating is saying, how can I be like other people? Toohey is saying, okay, how can I rule other people? Winand is saying, I really want to be like Howard Rock, but these other people will not let me. So how can I get them to pay for my private art gallery? How can I have power over them in order to, so that I can have this space separate from them? Dominic is saying these other people are messing the world up. There is no chance for somebody like Howard Rock to exist. How can I protect Howard Rock from these other people? So it's all about other people. And what the architecture is about you figuring out what Howard Rock is about, you figuring out about nature and about human beings and about the world and implementing that, building that. That's it. So that's my, and I think, Sherri, you did a fantastic job of showing what does this actually mean in design. And then what happens is that when you do that, another person, like the boy on the bicycle, can come and see that it can be done. All he's getting is it can be done. He still doesn't know how to do it. He had the desire for that. He did not know how to do it. He did not know whether it was actually possible. Now, all Howard Rock has given him is that, yes, it's possible, and it is here. So now go do it. So that's how I understand it. So wonderful, Sherri. That was fantastic. Next up is Rupali.
I'm going to talk about Louis Sullivan a little bit here. This section, part 4, is all about spring, transformation, love, right? So in Kindergarten Chats, Louis Sullivan talks about the powers of man, and the highest power being that of love, and love for humanity, love for each other, love for yourself. And you see this coming together in this last section of The Fountainhead. Also for Dominique and Gail Winan, this is the time when they transform. And Sherri was talking about how it's spring, but there's snow. And this is that time in the book where there's a little bit of transformation happening, but not yet. There is still the remnants of winter, but there is that hope of spring. And that's what you see in the section. So I'm going to read a little bit from Kindergarten Chats. Now, Kindergarten Chats is a dialogue between the teacher and the student, and it was written by Louis Sullivan. And the teacher is saying to the student that, I want you to go look at architecture. I want you to see the buildings that exist. And once you know what exists, how it has come to be, you'll be able to create your own. And he says, I want you to see the kind of architecture our cultured people believe in, because they do not believe in themselves. And so there's a lot of evil in there. He says, when we must strike hard and deep and search out the evil thoroughly. Then we may turn to pleasanter things. Then we may see the good. For there is much good in our people. I have faith in them. And the student says, oh, you stir up nothing but rottenness and the villainess of indecency and corruption. Oh, for a breath of fresh air. I yearn for a little touch of sunshine in this pessimistic gloom. One glimpse of lovely art, one soothing sight, a pleasant sound. My soul is sick. Is there no turn in this long, dreary, treeless, flowerless lane? No bypath, no shady nook, nothing to refresh and please the eye, to battle the heart, no sense of purity? Why did I even begin? If its consequence leads only and always to negation, give me something living and beautiful, something gracious. If it be a tree or a flower, or let me look far over the waves on the seashore into the soft blue sky, where I shall know peace of mind, relief from this nightmare. And this is what the boy on the bicycle is yearning for. And there he sees it. And that's like the spring song for him, where he can see this is possible, that here it is. So this section is about love, and not just, as I said, it's not love just between Dominique and Rourke in the romantic sense, but also love for humanity. And as Shrikant said, architecture is the combination of understanding nature and understanding the nature of man, and then bringing them together in harmony. So here is Spring Song from Kindergarten Chat, where Louis Sullivan says, they say that love is blind, but 'tis not so. Love is clairvoyant. The loved one is blind. They say many things, my lad, but 'tis not so. Where love is not, naught else exists. 'Tis why we live. 'Tis our last refuge. Our first hope. Love is love. It is the power of powers. So it is the highest power, according to Louis Sullivan, where you can then transform the world around you. He says, love comes to life and life comes to love. The twain are one. There's no difference. Good is born, power comes forth in splendor, tenderness is here. An overwhelming joy awakens as spring sings her limpid song, where we hear the melody and a bell sounds. For 'tis our spring that sings in the song, while springtime listens, murmurs her response. 'Tis our response to springtime's melting mood. And it's the response of the boy on the bicycle to what he sees in the valley, and then has the courage to say that this is possible in this lifetime, here and now on earth. So then Louis Sullivan goes on to say that, so hope in the spring, 'tis time for hope. So shall I believe in spring? It is the time to believe. So shall we will in the springtime. It is our time for willing. And in this section, we're going to see, how once you know how to say I, then you can make it possible because you believe in what you do, in your own values. Louis Sullivan says, surely you shall, if you will. The dogwood blooms in love of spring and bloom. For love is life, for love is you, for love is I, for love is the springtime. So, when we see in this this section where Gail Winan and Rourke meet, they also have the same kind of feeling towards each other. There is that love between the two of them, an admiration for each other. And they know they are similar in some ways, and they know they are different in some ways. And this section also explores that. For the boy on the bicycle, this is a nice kind of affirmation of what he believes in, that it is possible for him, and to make his own statement because he can see it over here. Now, I've shared this story before, but when I was in college in architecture, and very similar to what is said in kindergarten chats, everything around me and what we were studying in India, we were studying British architecture, right? So it made absolutely no sense. And you can see in the education system, it's really interesting to see they teach things that are irrelevant. And Sherri just talked about how materials give shape, give form to the structure, the function gives form to the structure. So one day as I was walking back from college to my house, I saw this really thin staircase at a construction site. And that construction site was like really covered with large compound walls so people couldn't see. But through a small hole, I saw this 1-inch staircase. I thought, that just cannot be true. And so I went in, and the staircase was just drawing me to it. There was nobody there. And this 1-inch thin staircase with multiple steps was right there, standing. It seemed so unreal. It was like folded paper. And so I had to see if it was for real. And so I climbed that staircase thinking it's going to break under my weight anytime. And I walked on it and I jumped on it, and it sprung back. It had like a life to it. It wasn't dead concrete that I was used to experiencing. And I had the same feeling that this boy on the bicycle had. It was real. This was possible. And I looked around, and from this construction hut walked out a man. And I said, do you know who built this? And he was, yes, I did. And he was this tall man, and I felt he was like a giant. And so this particular experience is really very personal to me, because I feel I've experienced this firsthand. And it's so important for children to see these works of art. And in Montessori, there's a large emphasis on bringing great pieces of art to students, whether it's through literature or music or artwork, sculpture. And the idea is to show what's possible. to children when they are younger so that they can strive for that ideal. The idea of the prepared teacher, that the teacher is a role model for the students. And so really rising above the standard to kind of say, you can get there too. And if you hold the bar high, the children will rise to that standard. So I think this section highlights that. And the part about where Gail Winan and Howard Roark meet each other, I just thought about what is a man that Louis Sullivan talks about. And he says, here is a man for you to look at, a man that walks on 2 legs instead of 4, has active muscles, heart, lungs, and other viscera, a man that lives and breathes, that has red blood, a real man, a manly man, a vital force, broad, vigorous, and with a whelm of energy, an entire man. And when Howard Roark and Gail Winan see each other and time stops for both of them, this was the image that came to my mind, was each of them recognized the manly man in the other. So Howard Roark and Gail Winan are similar and different in many ways. And Ayn Rand has done a great job of contrasts in The Fountainhead. So I'd like to continue with that, where, she talks about, you can see their leadership skills or leadership styles in this section, where we have Howard Roark being the leader, and Stephen Mallory is talking about Howard Roark as a leader. But they had really forgotten the world, thought Mallory. This was a new earth, their own. The hills rose to the sky around them as a wall of protection, and they had another protection. The architect who walked among them, down to the snow or the grass of the hillsides, over the boulders and piled planks, to the drifting tables, to the derricks, to the top of rising walls, the man who had made this possible. The thought in the mind of that man, and not the content of that thought, nor the result, not the vision that had created monadno, nor the will that had made it real, but the method of his thought, the rule of its function, the method and rule which were not like those of the world beyond the hills, that stood on guard over the valley and over the crusaders within it. And so here is a true leader. And then we have, let me just go to this page. Right. And then we also have Gail Winan and how he thinks of leadership. He says, as his hand moved back, he noticed the rows of buttons at the edge of his desk, bright little knobs with color code of their own, each representing the end of a wire that stretched to some part of the building, each wire controlling some man, each man controlling many men under his orders, each group of men contributing to the final shape of the word on paper to go to millions of homes, into millions of human brains, these little knobs of colored plastic there under his fingers. And that just brings an image of a very military rule of, we have a lesson when we teach division to students in Montessori, where you have the Roman centurion and the decurion and all these men under their charge, and everybody just passing the command on, where they don't have to think, they just have to do the actions. And that's the image I have, where Howard Roark believes in competency. He believes in every person's strengths. And Maritza talked about what Howard Roark thinks of collaboration. And it's not that he doesn't collaborate, it's how he sees strength in every person and recognizes that, and can bring that strength to the work that he's doing. Also, how Howard Roark makes the boy feel. The boy is encouraged by Howard Roark's work and finds that, he has the courage. It says, Howard Roark did not know that he had given someone the courage to face a lifetime. And Howard Roark had felt the same when he had seen Henry Cameron's work when he was younger. So, I think he knew, but in that moment, it's not the same feeling that the boy and Howard Roark have. Howard Roark has moved on, and the boy is beginning his life. He's young, and in Kindergarten Chats, Louis Sullivan says, where there's youth, there's hope. So that's where the boy is in his development, and Howard Roark is at a much later stage. And Gail Winan also has a boy working for him. And when this boy goes to get the material on Howard Roark for, I'm just going to find that section where he goes to find material on Howard Roark. The boy comes to Winan's desk and gives him a packet. And the boy stopped. There was nothing wrong, only the ridges on Winan's forehead. He did not know Winan well enough to know what these meant. He wondered what made him feel as if he should be afraid. So, here you can see the sense of life and how it affects people around him. Roark has the sense of joy. He embraces life. And Gail Winan is destructive, and he hates people, and he creates a sense of terror in them. And what's a better way to live, with joy or with terror? So I love the way she brings about that contrast. And we've talked about the similarities of their childhood, both coming from poor backgrounds, both working odd jobs. And we start seeing the difference in where Howard Roark builds his skills in the trades. He's working on construction sites, catching rivets. It's his favorite thing to do. And for Gail Winan, he's always being told that you don't run things around here. And he wants to run things, and he's like, I'm going to have people run things for me the way I want it. And so, although they come from similar backgrounds, they grow up to be different. And let me see if I can find the place. So Howard Roark and Gail Winan are talking, and Gail Winan says, were you actually homeless and starving? A few times. Did you mind that? No, I didn't either, says Gail Winan. I minded something else. Did you want to scream when you were a child, seeing nothing but fat ineptitude around you, knowing how many things could be done and done so well, but having no power to do them, having no power to blast the empty skulls around you, having to take orders, and that's bad enough, but to take orders from your inferiors? Have you felt that? Yes, says Howard Roark. Did you drive that anger back inside of you and store it and decide to let yourself be torn to pieces if necessary, but reach the day when you'd rule those people and all the people and everything around you? And Howard Roark says no. So that's where the big difference is, that, Howard Roark is not out to rule people. He's not there to teach them what to do. He's just there to do his own work. And because of the work that he does, people are transformed. His world is transformed. And if I say in Shrikant's diagram, because he believes in himself, and he's always striving for his highest potential, the work that he does with the love for humanity is a beautiful work. Whereas Gail Winan's process is just the reverse. So I want to end with the part, about, we said spring is uplifting, and spring gives you hope. And this section is all about hope. So at the end of chapter 5, And I often think, I actually learned this from Maritza. When we end the school day and we are out to do dismissal and we're getting out of the school door, I stop, I hold the door just in suspense. And I say, when we walk out, we're going to all look up. And every day there's a new thing when you look up. Sometimes we just see the tree changing colors. Sometimes we see the sun. In the evenings, we see the moon and the stars, sometimes planes flying by, snow and rain, but you're just aware. And I love this part where chapter 5 ends. When she had gone upstairs, Gail Winan walked to a window and stood looking up at the sky. His head thrown back, he felt the pull of his throat muscles and wondered whether the peculiar solemnity of looking up at the sky comes not from what one contemplates, but from that uplift of one's head. So with that, I'll end my part. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. I particularly liked your talking about the boy and the bicycle, your experience of the staircase and what your students need. It's the same thing, because what happens is that when you start your life, you really do not have an idea of what is possible. And it's all in the fog. So there is a lot of fog around what is actually possible to you. And experiences like this, Monadnock Valley, that ladder is like a hill. It's like, imagine a hill all covered in fog, and suddenly there is a ray of sunshine and there is somebody standing there, and you didn't even know that there was a hill, and you did not even know. You kind of wish that there was something, and you had a vague feeling, vague desire for it. But what these moments do is that they actually show you this person is actually standing there. It's all still covered with fog. It still requires a lot of effort to climb up there, but they show you that. It gives you the courage. It shows, then it's up to you, and then you move up. So beautifully put. Iris, would you be able to go next? Give me just a second. I'm going to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I always have a few little things first. I did some research on what Monadnock is. It's a geologic name for an isolated hill of bedrock. Got its name from the place in New Hampshire. When Rand used it, the word had a lot of associations that, unless you're deep into poetry, you aren't likely to know now. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote an extraordinarily long poem called Monadnock in 1846. Thoreau wrote many poems in the 1840s and 50s. Other people wrote about Monadnock, and they're mainly talking about this place in New Hampshire. Mark Twain, Willa Cather, H.P. Lovecraft, Thornton Wilder. It also is the oldest artist colony in the US. It was founded in 1907. Okay, so that takes care of that. So it's interesting, when she chose the word, people heard it differently than we're likely to hear it now. I had an experience quite similar to what's described by the boy on the bike. In Oak Creek Canyon in Sedona, Arizona, there's a very deep canyon. It's actually not terribly wide. As you drive down into it, you discover there are homes. It's like every, I don't know, measurements, every few acres or something. They are all separate. They're very beautiful. They look wonderful. As you're going down, you keep discovering that there are more and more of them. And just a beautiful experience. Okay, other tiny things. What Wynand sees in all of Rourke's buildings, it's really important. Rourke has to kind of dig it out of him, but what he sees in every building is joy. And that's one of their ties to each other, is that he can see that. And then a kind of silly thing, but I can't help it now. When I just read the description of the lobby, of the banner and all of the elevators and the people working there, it brings back Monsters, Inc. to me. That's one of the things that they did so beautifully in that funny movie. Okay, now the thing you asked me about, let me give context because not everyone will have heard it. Last week, I told of my Bauhaus experience. I described one of thousands of such experiences. I had them all the time, but this was most dramatic. In this thing, I was in a drawing class for high school age students. We did drawings, and then the teachers told everyone that the drawings that were done the past week were bad and that we should try harder on the same assignment. And I knew that the teacher hadn't told us what the standard was by which they were judging all of these works to be bad. And they also hadn't told us what they meant by try harder. I'm used to putting things into words. I notice when things like that happen. I was 14 at that point. Then after the second set of drawings were done, the teachers told us that, in fact, everything was wonderful, and they wanted to find out what we had been thinking when they told us that our work was bad. And there were 40 students or so in the class. I was in the middle. I heard the first 20 all say they felt guilty and they felt bad and they were trying harder. Nobody questioned that. Nobody questioned any part of anything. I did my part and I questioned it all and put into words what I had just said. And then afterwards, the other 20 students all said the same thing, that they felt bad and tried harder. So I sent Shrikant an email saying that I wanted to put that into context. My whole life was that kind of thing, of people saying things that made no sense to me. My parents had believed that you don't understand something, don't know it, unless you can put it into words. And they were engaged for 2 years, and they spent most of that time putting into words exactly what they wanted out of life, how they expected to do it, why they wanted to marry, why they wanted to have children, how they wanted to raise their children. They did a lot of research. They tried to understand how child raising was done in different cultures and different time periods, and then chose what was important to them. I was born 2 years after they were married, so by the time I was conscious of things, they'd been doing this for 6 years. They continued to do it all through their life. Their ideas for child raising were unique and wonderful. I'm going to be 82. I'm still figuring out things that they were doing. As I research and think, I see things that are like Montessori, things done in homeschooling and unschooling. It's just been amazing to continue to figure out what they were doing. And we talked about it as I got older, but there was still so much that had nothing to do with anything else that I saw in the culture. What they ended up with was what I see now as a kind of simplified version of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. My brother and I both consider that we were raised objectivist, but you know, you don't need that. I mean, anyone can use reason and critical thinking and work out a lot. For the past 65 years, when I try and do a kind of shorthand version of what my life was like growing up, I point to, I don't want to do any spoilers, I point to a town in Atlas Shrugged. It was as if I was growing up in this ideal world that Rand had created. One of my favorite sentences in Atlas Shrugged, or actually anything that Rand has written, is there's a person who has to make a choice, and someone says, consider the reasons which make us certain we are right, but not the fact that we are certain. And that's how I grew up. My parents had worked out so many ideas. They had so much to say about every part of life, but it was our choice. It wasn't that we were expected to just follow them. We could talk to them about the ideas, but it was our choices. Since preparing for this week, I've listened to the Monadnock Valley. I've been listening and reading the book a number of times, and I realize I can also point to Monadnock Valley. The people working there love their work. They feel as if it's summer all the time, and all of their experience brings them joy. And that was my childhood home. In my home, we all enjoyed our lives. None of us thought in terms of this odd thing out in the culture, thank God it's Friday, or not wanting Monday to come because I have to go to work. I mean, work was wonderful. There was no line between work and the rest of life. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, everything was creative and fun. My parents were wedding photographers. I don't think they ever asked us to help, but you had to take the prints and put them in big rolls of blotter paper. And of course, we helped with that. I mean, just, and it was all fun, and we had great conversations as we were doing it. By the time I was 5, I knew that everything said and done in my home made sense, was logical. I could ask my parents about anything going on. They had it in words. And as soon as I walked out the door, people out there were likely to say or do anything, things that made no sense. I'd go back home and tell my parents of all these absurd things I was seeing out in the world. And it really seemed to me that only my parents and I knew how to think and judge things in the world to find the most joy in life. The whole thing was very strange. We used to joke, my brother and I used to joke with my parents that they weren't a mother, in quotes, or a father, because they didn't do so many of the things we saw all other parents doing in life and in fiction. They didn't tell us what to do and how to think, or to think what we were to think. We were always treated with respect, at the level right for our age. This is just life. We lived with great enthusiasm and love for learning. We were never bored. I just got an email from someone a couple of days ago saying, are you ever bored? I've never been bored in my life. The world is so filled with things. I could always paint or draw, look through magazines. Once I could read and write, how could you be bored? I mean, there's, the life is so full. My parents were always sharing new, exciting, beautiful, and wonderful things they learned, and we did the same back. This idea in school of a book report, it was like, well, of course, you read a book and you told your parents, brothers, about all the wonderful things in the books. And I remember being invited to a Sweet 16 party, and I just read a book about the monkey trial. This is before the movie came out. And actually, the book that the movie was based on wasn't out yet. And but I'd read this odd book about this thing I'd never heard of. And I remember all of the girls sitting, listening to me as I paced back and forth, telling them this whole interesting story. And, they asked questions, they really were interested, but this is not what teenagers were supposed to be like then. I didn't get invited to many parties. Again, back to my parents, we never worked to be accepted or to conform or to fit in. We were very aware of how other people were living. We did not use the word they. It was too amorphous. And the worst version of they is, I would like to do X, but I can't because they won't let me. And we were very aware of that. And just nobody else seemed to be thinking about these things we were thinking about. We never did anything to be different, that is a purpose, but we ended up being different because we were starting so differently. I wondered if I'd ever find people beside my parents who came at life as I did. Then when I was 17, I was at a party, the kids I went to art school with, and someone criticized me because I wasn't drinking, and I had brought an art project of my own design to work on at the party. And I gave a lecture. I talked for about a quarter of an hour. I told them that I had had a good conversation with each person at the party. I was really enjoying it. And everyone in the party stopped to listen to my talk. And as soon as I was done, my best friend there, David, who I talked about last week, this artist, and his girlfriend came rushing over, and they told me that I sounded like a character in an Ayn Rand novel, and I should read The Fountainhead. And Atlas shrugged immediately. I had Fountainhead on my list. I would have gotten to it in a few months. It was fascinating to hear Sherri talk because she sounded just like me. A few pages into it, I knew I'd found an author who thought as I did, but I wondered if she understood what a life would be like for this character she'd created. This was life I was living. And then I read a few more pages, and it was clear that Rand knew much more than I did about such a person, and I could learn a lot from her. It's a few years later that I realized that among the people who appreciated Rand's writings, I was likely to find people who I understood and who understood me. My parents read the novels shortly after I did. They both said, "This is us." They went to objectivist lectures, subscribed to the newsletters and read them. My brother is 5 years younger. His introduction to objectivism was I'd come home from high school and say to my parents, I'm supposed to write on X subject. And they'd say, oh, there was an objectivist newsletter on it. Go look in the pile, you'll find it. And so that's how he became aware of the ideas. We both consider we were raised objectivists, even though Rand hadn't even created her philosophy in the formal sense by then. The way I describe what my parents did is a walking around version of objectivism, applying logic to all their thinking. One other little thing, and it becomes really appropriate after what was said earlier, The week before the party, I was with a big group of friends. We were just walking down the street in Chicago, and someone behind me, I don't know who it was, said they had a question for us. What is the purpose of life? I'd never heard the question before. I thought that was interesting. And I just thought about it for a second. I knew what the answer was, for each of us to enjoy our own lives. And I thought that settled it. There couldn't be any other answer. And then one at a time, the 12, 15 people behind me answered, and they all said the same thing, to live for others, which I thought was really weird. I'd never heard that before. I had no idea where they got it, but I knew my answer was right. Thanks.
Wow. Wow. Iris, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this is so special and so rare. You know, when you send that email, I said, look, you have to talk about this, because I wanted everybody to know it, because what happens is that many people come to objectivism from a very different kind of upbringing, and they have to remake themselves. There are actually many people, many in objectivism, who had kind of elements of it, but yours is the most kind of purest story that I have seen of, with the clarity with which you grasp the issues at a very young age, and the contrast between what you thought and what other people thought, and then discovering at a later stage. So this was just wonderful. I'm really honored that you agreed to talk about this. Thank you, Iris. Next up is Joia.
Thank you. I'm so glad that I get to go last and get to pull from the threads of everybody. And it's just so inspiring hearing Iris's story. I hope even in the future, she'll tell us even more about her parents, because now I'm just really curious to hear more about them and how they were able to figure out themselves, how to create this beautiful life that they, clearly created for themselves and then were able to pass on to their children. But I want to pick up, I'm even going to pull on threads from Rupali, because I definitely want to talk about love and spring. And I'm so glad that she talked about Louis Sullivan, because she's going to make my job so much easier. But I really even want to start my presentation by going way back, because unfortunately I missed you all on the last meetup you all had, but you all had such fascinating things to say. And so I even want to go back to the end of part 3. And then segue into part 4. And so I know it's not where we want to go, but I do want to take us back to the way we started with the last meetup, where we had the convocation of Toohey and the modernists. And Rob did such a great presentation where he even talked about some examples of actual modernists. He was talking about Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, and I just had to share because it just makes me think of every time I go to the Met. So every time I go to the Met, and Maritza can attest to this because I dragged her when she came along with me, I make it a point to go find the Dali crucifixion painting, which is not the official title of that painting, but it is such a beautiful painting. But unfortunately, that gorgeous painting is located deep in the bowels of the modernist section. So you have to walk all the way through all the other rooms. And there is one room in the Met where they literally have Jackson Pollock on one wall and Mark Rothko on the other. And it's like every time I go there, I literally have to have tunnel vision to the exit to avoid both of those modernist paintings. Definitely not my sense of life. But that said, I do have to say, that section in the Fountainhead has always frustrated me, even just from my understanding of the modernists, especially even from my perspective, even the modernists in literature. So Lois Cook, who's kind of based on Gertrude Stein. And there is an aspect of this that has always frustrated me from the point of, there's a concept in psychology of cognitive empathy. This is the idea of, empathy is putting yourself in the shoes of someone else, but not necessarily the, cognitive empathy is not about the emotional aspect of that. It's not having the feelings of another person, but putting yourself in their perspective in terms of their worldview, their ideas, their thoughts, their cognition, how they think about things. And it's always kind of frustrating to me to read that sequence, because I always feel that in a real sense, Ayn Rand kind of misses out what the modernists were all about in the way that they thought about themselves on their own terms. In this section, we have, Lois Cook kind of recognizing that, her work is trash and she doesn't compare with Ibsen, which is not what an actual modernist would have ever thought. Certainly the modernists did not respect Ibsen at all. They did not think Ibsen was great. They had all sorts of criticisms of thinking Ibsen was too naturalistic and didn't recognize the artificiality of the medium enough, and all sorts of criticisms of Ibsen. And similarly, they would have not have thought of themselves as being mediocre. But that said, there is a line in this section that really intrigues me, that I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time on, because it occurred to me, we've also had discussions in previous meetups of the self-awareness of the characters. And something else that's frustrated me about this book, about Tui, that I've talked about is, and Rob put this so brilliantly when he kind of compared Tui to Satan in Paradise Lost, the way in which Satan is a believer in the Christian religion. He's not an atheist. He doesn't belong to another religion. He believes in the Christian God, but he's going to turn his back on it. And I think the parallel to Tui is perfect, because Satan turns his back on God because he realizes he can never be God, but at least he can have power and rule in hell. And we're going to see that that's literally what Tui is going to do. He's going to very consciously try to create a world that he knows would be a hell, but at least he would be the ruler. But that said, when he's kind of describing what his method is here, there was something really insightful here. Sometimes even, because, Tui, I think, is in many ways a deep reflection of Ayn Rand. Sometimes he, comes out with these lines that I think really are insightful. And so there's this one line where he talks about, here, I got to find exactly where this was. Where he's talking about, why, Tui is going to promote the work of Lance. And so he says, talking about, this author, Tui says, when the fact that one is a total non-entity who's done nothing more outstanding than eating, sleeping, and chatting with neighbors becomes a fact worthy of pride, of announcement to the world, and of diligent study by millions of readers, the fact that one has built a cathedral becomes unrecordable and unannounceable, a matter of perspectives and relativity. The distance permissible between the extremes of any particular capacity is limited. The sound perception of an ant does not include thunder. And earlier today, Rob was even talking about how here in this book, we see how Ayn Rand almost seems to grasp in metaphorical ways ideas that she's going to develop with much more philosophical precision later on in her work. And so we know that later on in her work, she develops a whole theory of concepts that all has to do with the relations and the contrast. And this is going to be her theory of how we form concepts, is precisely through this process of differentiation and then integration. But it's interesting how Tui is even, grasping how this works in this metaphorical way, this idea that the sound perception of an ant does not include thunder. And that if you don't get the relationships, the differentiation and the integration right, that that there's a way in which a person will not even be able to recognize the grandeur or the greatness of a cathedral because they don't have the context, essentially is what she's saying here. They don't even have the context to appreciate what that is. And to me, this was such an insightful way to even think about evil. And in the last conversation, you guys were having such a great conversation about evil and mediocrity, and about drift and the comforts of drift and evasion, and how people fall into evil. And I thought this was even just a profound way to think about how it is that evil can manifest in the world in a way that doesn't even require intention or self-awareness. It occurs to me that a person could have within their own thinking rather good intentions, but because perhaps the context that they're bringing to a situation, doesn't permit as she describes it here, right? They don't have the idea of what the extremes would be, that they wouldn't even have the ability to grasp what a cathedral is. And it reminded me even of a specific example I had way back many years now, with someone who was coming to reading this book from the perspective of what now often gets called queer theory, but this person was definitely coming from like an LGBTQ background, and I'll say to even give a charitable interpretation to this person, it was my impression that this was a person who in their own life had really struggled with their own sexuality. This was obviously before gay marriage, but this had become the lens through which they saw the world. And so it was just really striking to me when they read this book that their whole analysis of this book, The Fountainhead, was all about looking at repressed homosexuality between Rourke and Wynand. And I'll say, I think this person even has something of a point, and it might be something worth exploring, but how much this person was missing out on because of the lens through which they were choosing to read this book, that they had missed Ayn Rand's whole point. She has this whole grand vision, this grand project of trying to figure out and project to us the ideal man, the ideal human being. And the way that this person was so unable to even grasp what that project could be, precisely because of the limited lens through which they were going to approach this book. And I do want to get us into section 4, which Shrikant was pointing out. This really is going to be the climax where we do really get to focus most directly on this question that is Ayn Rand's big project, which is who is the ideal? Because as Shrikant was pointing out, here everything is going to be about Rourke and Wynand and Dominique, those characters who really get it. And I think it's even important to point out that maybe even just in passing, that if you've ever seen the Fountainhead movie, where Ayn Rand did the adaptation, and she realized in adapting her novel to the screen that there was a lot that she was going to have to cut out. And her own choice was to minimize the whole sections about Peter Keating and Ellsworth Toohey, that the whole drama between Wynand and Dominique and Rourke was, she saw as really being the heart of this whole story. And so now we're going to be in the part of the novel where we're really going to get to go into that. But before we do get there, I did just even want to stop at the very end of section 3, and just to have a moment of reflection on how section 3 ends before we jump into section 4. One of the things that Shrikant had pointed out to us, he has that beautiful analogy of thinking of the structure of the novel like the Beethoven symphony, and we've looked at the way that the different sections correspond. And one of the things that we've seen is, so we have the 4 different sections. They're each named after one of these men. And we see there that, at the end of each section is essentially the high point for that character. So if you remember, the end of section 1, which was Peter Keating, ended with the Cosmo Slotnick building. And of course, we've examined how much that was even an empty achievement, but that is the high point for Peter Keating. The end of section 2 ended with the Stoddard Temple, and even specifically the moment when Rourke kind of had that breakdown moment to come see how they destroyed it, and how that really is the high point for Ellsworth Toohey, as awful and destructive as that is, and how even in his greatest moment of triumph, it's not even complete, because even though Rourke had that moment of having to come see what actually happened, his ultimate response is that he doesn't really think of Ellsworth Toohey. But then I think it's interesting to reflect on how we're going to end section 3, which is the Wynand section, and what it perhaps suggests to us about Wynand's triumph, especially if we look at it through that lens. And this is just even one of my favorite passages of the book. So Maritza has told us multiple times about one of her favorite lines from this novel is how in order to say I love you, one must first know how to say the I. And here at the climax of the Wynand section, we get what I even see as being just a deeper exploration of what that idea is all about. And I think it's even going to give us some real insight into this character for us to take into the final section here. And this is just, as I said, one of my favorite passages that I just love to read. So this is where Wynand says, I love you, Dominique. I love you so much that nothing can matter to me, not even you. Can you understand that? Only my love, not your answer, not even your indifference. I've never taken much from the world. I haven't wanted much. I've never really wanted anything. Not in the total, undivided way. Not with the kind of desire that becomes an ultimatum. Yes or no. And one can't accept the no without ceasing to exist. That's what you are to me. But when one reaches that stage, it's not the object that matters, it's the desire. Not you, but I. The ability to desire like that. Nothing less is worth feeling or honoring. And I've never felt that before. Dominique, not in the sense I say it about you, mine. Did you call it a sense of life as exaltation? You said that. You understand. I can't be afraid. I love you, Dominique. I love you. You're letting me say it now. I love you. So even just, reflecting on that as the high point for Wynand. And I think it is really interesting because there is another stage that's going to happen that we've already obviously seen in this work. And many of the panelists have described this meeting as explosive, which I love. Thinking about the explosion of what happens when these two characters who really do embody the ideal encounter one another. But there is something interesting that we're going to see happen, because as much as this is going to, represent perhaps a higher stage for Wynand, it's also going to be, we're going to see the seeds of his destruction as well. But then I do want to take us to the moment of the Gail Wynand and Howard Roark meeting. And I want to say, I do think of the Howard Roark, Gail Wynand relationship as the grand love affair of this book. And I think we see that right in the moment of their very first meeting. And Rupali already gave us such a great way into this, when she reflected on the Louis Sullivan idea of when they encounter each other and they think this is a man. And it was certainly part of Ayn Rand's view of the world. She had a belief in love at first sight. It was her own story of how she met her husband. And it's of course something that we see throughout her novels, that when the characters meet each other, there is this kind of instantaneous recognition. And I just think it's even just beautiful the way that that it's described here in the meeting of Wynand and Roark. And the other significant aspect of this that I wanted to talk about was also her view, which Wynand had talked about at one point in section 3. She has this idea of love as exception making, which I think is really interesting and something else I hope we can stop and reflect upon, what it might mean to think of love as exception making. And of course, the word love, that there's so many meanings of the word love. There is the kind of meaning of love that perhaps is closest to benevolence, which is the kind of love that you can feel for everyone. But there is an important sense. I think Ayn Rand is really getting at an important truth, that when you meet what you might consider your great love, whether that might be a romantic love, or even if you think about the love that you might feel for your children, or for those people who really are the most important people in your life, there really is a way in which that deepest kind of love is a kind of exception making, just by its very nature, because that kind of love you just can't give to everyone. There's not enough time. There's not enough emotional energy. What it really means to love someone, with that kind of devotion, where it becomes part of your identity and who you are. What that means of love as exception making, and that's exactly what we see happens in this first encounter between Rourke and Wynand. That they have that moment where, they see each other. This is Gail Wynand. This is Howard Rourke. It says, then Wynand rose, his hand motioned in simple invitation to the chair beside his desk. Rourke approached and sat down, and they did not notice that they had not greeted each other. Wynand smiled and said what he had never intended to say. He said very simply, "I don't think you'll want to work for me." "I want to work for you," said Rourke, who had come here prepared to refuse. So right there, that sense of love as exception making, and also this idea of her view of love, which we've already seen in the Rourke-Dominique relationship, but is just going to be magnified that much more in the Rourke-Wynand relationship, which is this idea of the way in which they understand each other, like that they're already sort of in the midst of a conversation, that they didn't even require a greeting, that they already have this depth of understanding of each other, and it's like they're just picking up midstream in a relationship that had been around forever, even though they're just meeting themselves for the very first time. And I think this is just, part of Ayn Rand's view, because she's so focused on the ideal man. And, I've talked about, this idea of, Ayn Rand's religion is all about the ideal man. And so, of course, there's something powerful when the ideal men encounter and recognize and get to interact with each other. And of course, there is a difference, because Rourke is the fully expressed version of the ideal man, whereas Wynand, I always think of him as being the flawed version of the ideal man. He has that capacity, that same inner core as Rourke, but ultimately does go wrong. And so that's even what's going to bring us some of the drama and tension for the novel. But still, just the importance, for Ayn Rand's religion of what happens when the ideal men come in contact. And I wanted to even then take it to just another one of my absolute favorite scenes in this whole book. Maritza was already kind of giving us some introduction to this whole section, but this is the section that I always call the Great Amen. Which again, I think is just, just another beautiful expression of what I've been calling the Ayn Rand religion. And what we learn about the Ayn Rand religion from the way that these two men, encounter each other and what they're able to share when they finally do meet. So again, just one of my favorite passages in this whole book when Rourke says, "What you feel in the presence of a thing you admire is just one word: yes. The affirmation, the acceptance, the sign of admittance. And that yes is more than an answer to one thing. It's a kind of amen to life, to the earth that holds this thing, to the thought that created it, to yourself for being able to see it. But the ability to say yes or no is the essence of all ownership. It's your ownership of your own ego, your soul, if you wish. Your soul has a single basic function: the act of valuing. Yes or no. I wish or I do not wish. You cannot say yes without saying I. There's no affirmation without the one who affirms. In this sense, everything to which you grant your love is yours." And then Maritza gave us just that great exploration of what that might mean for Wynand. But I just even wanted to pause here for what we learn here about what I've been calling the Ayn Rand religion. What it is that we say amen to. Her whole vision of what the soul is. In her view, the soul, as she says it, is that which in you, which has this one basic function, which is the act of valuing. That ability to say yes or no. And that yes or no, it's the yes or no of truth or falsehood, but it's also the yes or no of, good versus evil. And we're going to see for her why it's so significant, the connection between the soul and the ego, the I, precisely because it is the first-handed ego is the one that has that full capacity to say yes or no. So I just love that whole section of, what it is that you say yes or no to, and just even thinking more deeply about what that is. But lastly, I do even just want to say a couple things about spring, which Rupali already just he alluded to and talked about so beautifully. And Sherri mentioned how I guess it's snowing where she is. Here in Jersey, same thing. We've had cold, freezing rain all day. And if anyone's watching the video, you should know it's March 12th here. So we're at that precipice where we are so close to spring. And definitely when I was reading the book this way, I've had this feeling of I just can't wait for spring to come. I will say I definitely agree with Jack that November is the anti-life month. Although I will say Rupali's, architecture is beautiful, and I do love fall. So October is one of my favorite months of the year by far. But by the time you get to November and all the leaves fall, and you turn the clocks back, and it's just dark all day. And I do love Thanksgiving, but otherwise, no, I'm totally with Jack that November is the anti-life month. But just even thinking about the meaning of spring, and even how spring has been so important metaphorically in all of the grand world religions. And so, Rupali was already sharing about Louis Sullivan and his view, how the kindergarten chats ends with the song of spring, and there's that whole idea of growth and decay. But certainly this has been true of religious perspectives always, to think about the death and the resurrection, and then the cycles of dying and rebirth, and to really think about what we mean by life. And if we think about work as being the way and the truth and the life, you might say, and what we learn about what you could call the Ayn Rand religion, even through her glimpses of what spring is all about. And so, Sherri already read to us the beautiful passage that starts section 4 here with the boy on the bicycle. And the idea of the green. I want even to point out that there was, that description where, it's described as living sparks without edges. To me, I thought that was even, it's a description of spring, but it was also even just a beautiful description of the boy. That's who the boy is. He's that living spark, but he doesn't have the edges yet. It's still, it's unformed. There's that glimpse of something that's possible that he hears in the music, but there's no shape to it, and he's not yet able to give it shape. And, and obviously seeing Monadnock is going to be so important to his ability to be able to do that. But how we're thinking of that's even what this promise of spring is. And Maritza had mentioned in all the other sections, we see the childhood story of all the characters, and we never get that with work. But what we do see is the example of this boy on the bicycle. And I think he's even supposed to be sort of our sense of, how a youth can eventually transform into a Rourke. He's like the younger version of what a work spirit might have been like. But then I did want to turn to this other description of when they're building Monadnock, and just this view of what spring is all about. So when work and his crew that he brings in, and he brings in Mallory and Mike and a bunch of other workers who obviously share his perspective, they're there working through the winter. But there's this description that they did not think of the snow, the frozen clots of earth, wind whistling through the cracks of planking, thin blankets over army cots, stiff fingers stretched over coal stoves in the morning before a pencil could be held steadily. They remembered only the feeling, which is the meaning of spring, one's answer to the first blades of grass, the first buds on tree branches, the first blue of the sky, the singing answer, not to grass, trees, and sky, but to the great sense of beginning, of triumphant progression, of certainty in an achievement that nothing will stop, not from leaves and flowers, but from wooden scaffoldings, from steam shovels, from blocks of stone and sheets of glass rising out of the earth. They received the sense of youth, motion, purpose, and fulfillment. So as we're going into section 4 and also into section, or also into the spring season here, all of us here, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe we can all reflect as well on this meaning of spring and this idea of the sense of youth, motion, purpose, fulfillment, the sense of beginning, the triumphant progression, and the certainty of an achievement that nothing can stop. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, Joia. So I have 3 points. The first point, I was noticing that this description of people working on the Monadnock Valley parallels the description in the Stoddard Temple, where it's just those 4 people. Also, the Stoddard Temple parallels Monadnock Valley. Stoddard Temple is the artistic creation to make you feel like that. Monadnock Valley is the same. It's the Stoddard Temple built in the world where you are the statue, where each person who's living can feel that way about their life. So it is Stoddard Temple brought onto the world. So it is initially it is the laugh with the cliffs as the starting point. Then you have the Stoddard Temple, and then you have the Monadnock Valley. That is the progression. It was the first point. The second point, I really liked your point that when she had to do the movie adaptation, she basically focused on part 4. And that's exactly, and that's where exactly the whole issue is. The third point is, what is the issue? And I think the yes and no captures it. Howard Rock says it, and it's the yes, it is the deepest yes to life, to yourself, to the world, to existence, to consciousness, to everything. So it's yes. And what is the difference between Howard Rock, Dominique? What is common between them? Howard Rock, Dominique, and Winan is that they have that yes in them. The question is, there are people who have no in the place of yes. And those are the other people that surround, lots of people who surround you. And the question is simply, what is the relationship between the yes and the no? Dominique and Winan think that the no will win out. That yes exists within the context of no. Whereas Howard Rock is saying that yes is fundamental and no is a parasite within it. So that relationship is what is going to be worked out in part 4. Wonderful. Now we have one person here. Now I have read the Fountainhead 8 times, and I have watched the Fountainhead movie 1 time. We have one person here who has watched the movie Fountainhead 8 times and read the Fountainhead 1 time. So I want to ask Tony what he thinks of Fountainhead. Tony, you're welcome to comment on any part of Fountainhead, any structure. Go right ahead, Tony. Tony, if you could unmute.
There we are. All set?
Yes.
Okay. The main thing I learned is that I need to watch the Fountainhead movie a 9th time and read the book about 10 more times, because everyone has given me insights that I didn't. Of course, when I read it, I was a much younger man. I was, only 71. No, but I wasn't capable of getting the insights when I first read it. to me, it was all about the ideal man and could you aspire and would you stand up for what you really believed in and don't put up with the people who want to put you down. So I really need to rethink it and go over it again. I would like to make a couple of comments on what other people said, just really, really briefly. First of all, a lot of people said things that I was going to say because you stole it from me, you rotten people. And but I wanted to go back, make full circle to Rob and talking about Rourke's bending the branches, the meaning of life. And it occurred to me at the point, because I'm thinking about how would I create the character? How would I represent the character? Would I represent a character sort of as emblematic, the way Rand gets criticized by making emblematic characters. She gets criticized because people don't see the arc of the character. They don't see character development. They see Rourke's the ideal guy, Tui's the devil, everything is set this way. There is development of the character, I think, in the books, but I also think there is an interesting art in and of itself to create an emblem that continues and represents itself in subtle ways. Having said that, it occurred to me that when Rourke bends the branch and he is talking about the meaning of life, Winant does the exact same thing, but instead of bending the branch, he tries to bend people. And that's the key thing for me. It was a key thing because when Winant wants his special house built by Rourke, he wants to control Dominique in the house. For him, it's all about control. Rourke wants to control, but he wants to control nature. He wants to bend nature, which doesn't hurt anyone, to what he would like to contribute first for his own well-being, but also accidentally or in addition to contribute to the larger good, where Rourke wants to bend people so that the larger good would contribute to him. And this is not a simple thing about selflessness and selfishness at all. It's a much more complex thing. And I also noticed an interesting, this is what I mean about the emblems were taking a separate art. Gail Winant can't stand to lose. So he ends up, after defending Howard Rourke, we're talking about the end of the book now, he gives up on that because he doesn't want to lose the banner and ends up losing his life. Right? He ends up losing because he didn't want to lose. Dominique, who, by the way, I'd love to have a separate discussion of, is one of the craziest, most screwed up characters that you love in any book I've ever read, starting from dropping the statue down the shaft, okay? But also marrying Peter Keaton, what are you thinking? It's like, you're messed up. But Dominic feels she needs to punish herself for wanting the ideal, right? Where Howard, and so Dominic punishes herself for wanting the ideal because otherwise she has to face a win-lose situation. She can't have the win she wants. So she's going to control the loss by punishing herself with Keating. And then later she marries Winant, thinking he's a worse guy than Keating, but finding out he has other qualities. The final level of that hierarchy is Howard Rourke, who doesn't mind losing. I mean, he ends up working in a construction site. He doesn't sell his architecture at all. And he ends up the final victor because he is courageous enough to accept the loss as just part of life. Okay, no problem, I can handle it. We'll go on from here. And I think that's a real important hierarchy, even if you look at the characters as emblematic rather than as producing a developmental arc. Two more points. At some point, if I'm ever lucky enough to talk to Sherri personally, I'd love to find out, I'd love to discuss the comparison and contrast between Frank Lloyd Wright and the Bauhaus, because they're my two favorites, and they're different and yet the same. Final point, I disagree with November as the anti-life month. It's February, because February is the end of winter and it's before things become mud-luscious and puddle wonderful in March. And that's all. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Wonderful.
Appreciate the time.
Tony, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. And what we'll do is that everybody's, we will have chance to comment. Everybody will have chance to comment, but let people who have been listening put their thoughts and comments and questions on the table. And then keep track of all the questions, all the comments you have. And then everybody, I'll give a chance for panelists to comment on all of these things that are being said. So it's going to be Joe followed by Laura. Joe.
Yes. Thank you to everyone again. I mean, everybody did a really wonderful job. And Tony, you're absolutely correct. It is February. And
you.
actually, you did, you took most of my points, though, so I'm a little bit disappointed in that. So I do see this as, Ayn Rand developing a philosophy of life, and essentially she's doing it through this ideal, which is hard work, right? And I mean, we all see that. And I think what Tony had mentioned, and this is where I really thought it is, if you think about it, it's really about control. And if you look at it from a Stoic perspective, what do you control? What's the dichotomy of control? How does that factor into this? And so when Winan offers to make work his personal architect, just to essentially own him, the only thing he has in his control is his character, what he wants to build. So he says no, and essentially he's maintaining his independence. But what Gail Winan is controlling is externals, or things that are outside of his control. And that's a dangerous way to manage your life in general, if you think about it. So it becomes, I almost thinking about it in the religious context or something like this, I almost felt that was like a Christ-like moment in the desert, where bow before me and I'll give you all these kingdoms that you could possibly want. But what would that have done to Christ's relationships? The idea, why would they be friends with him? Would they be friends with him because he had all these kingdoms, or would they be friends with him because of who he is? And I think that this is where you're talking about the idea of character and authenticity that kind of factor into this. And we even talked last night a little bit about the diluted mind and during the Bhagavad Gita meetup. And that was interesting as well. And the diluted mind is basically you're managing yourself to the periphery. You're managing yourself to externals. And in doing that, you're unable to see the authentic self of the other people around you. You're unable to appreciate people's authenticity because you're forgoing your own authenticity in that process. So that's a really important point when you're thinking about how this is why hard work actually relates to people so well. And I mean, I know people feel uncomfortable around him. However, he's able to relate to people because he's actually his authentic self. And I think that that's kind of one of those, one of the main points in general that Ayn Rand speaks to. I think the idea, if you're relying on like things like prestige or anything else, that's what Peter Keating is essentially following, that path. And what happens within that context is it actually distances you from everybody, in the sense that, okay, I'm going to get the job, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But everything that he's managing to himself, he realizes he's no longer in control of his own life. And his relationships are subject to everyone else. and as well as his own personal happiness in that process. So, I mean, I think that this idea that how these relate into the religious context, how Ayn Rand is developing this ideal that is embodying, someone that can, turn down kingdoms, turn down everything, and maintain their own personal character, their authentic self, in order to relate to other people in a genuine way. It's that this is a religious. Now it's a different perspective on it too. She's kind of embracing the ego, as opposed to a little bit more, even though we can call it a rationalist ego, or how she embraces the ego, it's a little bit different. But she embraces the ego, whereas religions tend to see that as the enemy per se. So I think that's I think it's really interesting to look at it as this is the development of a philosophy of life and almost a godlike character, and how that this individual is relating to the world and to others, and through essentially focusing on what is in their power, what is in their control. That's essentially how he's doing it. So it kind of reaffirms Stoicism, philosophically speaking, in that the only thing that really matters is your character. And if you're only managing things to within your control, then that's basically how it works. Anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. I'll make one quick comment that the word ego is used exactly opposite, has exactly opposite meaning for Ayn Rand and Bhagavad Gita. Laura, you're next. What do you think about the part 4, or do you have any questions? Laura.
I have a mindset. I think yesterday
Laura, there is all kinds of audio problems you have. You want to try one more time? Go ahead. Nope, can't hear you. Can you unmute one more time?
Okay. Somebody mentioned yesterday.
Laura, there is a lot of feedback. We can't hear you. It's coming up twice. You can type it in the chat. We'll take it up from there. Does anybody else have any comments or questions? You can go ahead, and otherwise, I want to. You're welcome to do that. I want to talk about one point that Tony made. I really like his observation that Winan lost by not wanting to lose, because actually it is about the dichotomy of control. Laura, go ahead, try it again.
Think about a Mobius strip. Think about
Laura, your sound, it just has feedback. Can't hear you. You have 2 different devices, which you need to close one of them. Okay, so this point about Winan loses because he doesn't want to lose. Because what he does is that he's trying to win with these people who are trying to say no to the world. And he wants them to Sorry, Laura, please, it's not working, Laura. Give me just a second, hold on. I'm going to, okay. Laura, it's not working. Go ahead and type your question. Or you can turn off one of your devices. You are logged in on your phone and on your computer, and they are causing interference. We can't hear anything. Okay. So Winan, he says, I don't want to lose. And he's trying to control people who are bad. And he thinks he can control them. And in the process, he ends up destroying himself. Whereas what Howard Roark does is that whenever he's dealing with negative people, he tries his best. And if they win a battle, they win the battle. He loses. But the pain goes only up to a point. The core of his being remains completely intact to continue functioning. Whereas Winan takes the core of his being and turns it into pretzels in order to quote unquote control other people. He does build the Winan papers as a result of that. But when he says, oh, you know what, I have Winan paper, now I can defend Roark, he fails. So it was basically, as I think Rob pointed out, or Sherri pointed out, when he's walking, I think it was Rob, he was walking in his Hell's Kitchen, he says, I never got out of here. You know, the world still completely controls me. So it's beautiful, beautiful point about that he lost because he did not want to lose. And it's all about dichotomy of control. He did not focus on what he could control. He tried to control things that he could not control. All right. Anybody, any of the panelists want to comment on anything or put any question on the table? You're welcome to do that. It's been such an amazing conversation. I can't believe it. It's like everybody was so good. Rob and Sherri.
Well, one thing that came up that I wanted to say something briefly about is that this issue that, and it's kind of a pattern in Ayn Rand's works, that the ideal man we never see his childhood. You know, we get the background of, we don't really see Peter King's childhood, but we see his mom, and we get an idea of, you know, how he came to be for Mrs. Keating. But we get to see Winan's childhood. We get to see Tui's childhood. We get some hints here and there about Dominique's childhood, but Roark basically, you know, comes like Athena out of Zeus's head, fully formed and fully armed. And that's kind of a standard thing that she has with her heroes. She has it in I'm not, without giving away anything too much, she has it in Atlas Shrugged
Oh,
too.
you just gave it all away.
The ideal man has, we have no idea about his background, his childhood. We don't get back into how he came to be. But I think that's kind of deliberate on her part, because the idea is her ideal man is totally self-made. So the idea is he's not the product of his background. We don't need to know what happened to this toilet training, or you know, what his mom was like, or you know, what experiences he had in school when he was a kid, because those aren't the things that made him what he is. What made him what he is himself. He made himself what he is. And that's, I think she's sort of emphasizing that by having them be totally self-made, so that it doesn't really matter. They usually come from some sort of modest background. They're all from Ohio, of course. The ideal man is from Ohio. But we don't really need to know the background, because they made themselves. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of Roark's conversation with Mallory when he meets him, where he says, you know, don't tell me about, I think, or Mallory says it to Roark, says, let's not talk about the trivial things in life. Let's not talk about, you know, where we're from or our background. Let's talk about our work. Let's talk about what's really important. And that's sort of what she's doing with those characters by not giving them a background, is that, you know, where they come from, where they grew up, where they went to school, their parents, all of that doesn't matter. What matters is the part of themselves that they made through their own effort, the self-made part, and how that's manifested in the work, in the main thing they chose, which is their work. So I think that's deliberate. And also to Tony, I want to say, you're coming in, we've had all sorts of conversations about whether Dominique is crazy or not. And so there's some of us who are on, there's some here who are on Team Dominique, and there are others of us who are not exactly on Team Dominique. So there's been a long discussion about that.
Team Dominique is doing their best, and they're actually doing a pretty good job. So if you want to read all the previous or watch all the previous episodes, you're going to get a much better understanding of her.
Wonderful. I want to comment on, okay, before that, Maritza, go ahead.
So just a few quick points. So I think I'm going to contradict a little bit something you said, Shrikant. I'm going to go back to this. I love the way Joia called it the amen scenario. Howard's yes is what I call it. That's what I have in my notes. So when he describes to us, the ability to say yes or no is the essence of all ownership. So to me, I have never viewed it as Howard is the yes and Winan is the no, just because I think that Winans is a yes, but with condition.
No, just a second. I want to clarify. I didn't say that. I said all three of them are saying yes to existence. It's the difference, but they realize there are other people who are saying no.
Mm-hmm.
So
See,
go ahead.
Fair. But what I saw here in this statement is that I saw something, just a slight nuance different here. The idea that it doesn't actually matter if you're saying yes or no. It's the ability to say it with conviction. And what she's painting, and as I perceive it, she's painting for us the picture that all these other characters don't have the ability to say yes or no. The main characters do. And then she shows, that ability by itself isn't enough to create the ideal, but you can't even start to get there until you can say either yes or no. It's the affirmation. And that's just wanted to point that out.
No, that's excellent point. I mean, that ability to say yes or no, that is absolutely the key. The second point I would make, and I want to connect this to the point that Joe made about ego. In Bhagavad Gita and in Ayn Rand, ego means exactly opposite. In Ayn Rand, ego means your own ability. It's you, to put it in religious terms, Bhagavad Gita, it is between you and God. It is between you and nature. It's between you and what are the eternal principles. You are trying to figure that out. And you are going to act according to it, regardless of what other people are going to say. That is what Ayn Rand means by ego. Now, that is exactly what Bhagavad Gita means by saying Atma, focused on God. It's like the core of your being, trying to understand the nature of universe and acting according to it. Ego, as used in Bhagavad Gita, is when you get attached to the periphery, you get attached to the forms of what is part of what other people think is important, what you think you should. So it's basically you get attached to peripheral and identify yourself with that. So that is Peter Keating. So by Bhagavad Gita standards, it's Peter Keating who has the ego, because he's trying to position himself externally without having the core, without having the focus on the core. So it's exactly opposite meaning. Okay, anybody else would like to say something? I think, Tony, did you have something?
Sorry. No, I needed to go because I haven't had lunch and I'm about
That's
to go
fine.
like this. But
All right, no problem.
I wanted to mention just one thing about your ego statement about the Gita and Rand. It's her distinction between egoism and egotism.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
very
really
good.
what it boils down to, and very simply. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I want to say thank you to everyone. I appreciate your welcoming me. And although my butt sore from sitting so long, I do appreciate the intellectual interaction. And thank you so much. Good to meet everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Be
Ebony,
well.
Great to meet you too, Tony.
Thank you.
Great to meet
Rob,
you,
thank you.
Tony.
Bye-bye.
bye, Tony.
Bye.
Ebony.
I have a question. Would Ayn Rand's view of ego be the same as of Louis Sullivan's view of ego? Because the way I look at it is that Louis Sullivan has that same view of self as the person who decides for himself what he's going to do or how he's going to learn. So I'm just wondering if that's similar.
Okay, Houheneka, that's a brilliant question. Okay, the reason for that is actually Louis Sullivan is a middle point between Bhagavad Gita and Ayn Rand. Because Bhagavad Gita influenced transcendentalism. So this idea of form, function and form, etc., is very much influenced with the way in which Louis Sullivan thinks is very much influenced by that. So that's he's exactly the middle term, and he has had profound impact on Ayn Rand. So there is that. So this, when Toohey says to Rourke that, or Toohey through Stoddard says to Rourke that you are religious in your own way, that's exactly what he is referring to. So so that's what I would say. But I'm going to open it up for anybody else who wants to comment. Sherri, you want to say something? No? Okay. But essentially, I mean, it's the core idea is that what really matters. Another way is, so whenever there is an issue like that, it's better to just jettison the word and look at the meaning. So both Louis Sullivan and Ayn Rand and Gita are saying that, you have to act from the core of your being, and you have to be focused on the nature of the world. That's it. And you conduct yourself based on that, regardless of what other people are doing. Even if they are going in the opposite direction, you do what needs to be done, what you should do. That's what Louis Sullivan would say. That's what Ayn Rand would say. That's what Gita also says. So that's what is common to them. But it's very easy to have what Louis Sullivan calls the inverted self. Okay, so inverted self means you put forms before function and you get attached to the forms. Mostly it is done through social forms that are there, that everybody is doing this. My mom is going to things that I should marry this person. All of that is kind of going for forms. And then that destroys the function. That is the inverted personality. And that is what is bad. So that, that's how I would capture it. All right, folks, these presentations are getting better and better. And we have only 2 parts left. No, 2, probably 3 more parts left. Right? 3. 5, 5, 5 is what we will do. I might move it one over here or there, depending on the structure, if whatever is the logical unit. At least 4, maximum of 6 chapters. I don't know which ones, whether it's going to be 5 next time, 4 next time, 5 next time, 6, one of those. All right. Very, very excited. I am delighted to be in part 4. I enjoy this the most. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.